Chapter 1 of Stories of Alpine Adventure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. On Mountaineering. Mont Blanc is the monarch of the mountains. They crowned him long ago on a throne of rocks, in a robe of clouds, with a diadem of snow. By Byron. The love of adventure is part of human nature. Almost all of us have it in a greater or less degree, though all of us have not the opportunity of indulging it. Even those who have not the nerve and daring requisite for adventure in its more exciting and hazardous forms, read eagerly of the feats performed or attempted by others. Our own country is full of men, aye, and women too, who have risked life and limb in perilous achievements by land or sea. Indeed, the love of adventure for its own sake is one of the chief characteristics of the English-speaking race, and it has been of untold value to us in our progress as a nation. Of all adventurous recreations, mountaineering is at once the most exacting and the most fascinating. Yet, strangely enough, little more than 100 years ago, climbing as a pastime was unknown, and even after the triumph of Jacques Balmat, Mont Blanc was for many years the only mountain which received any attention. The formation of the Alpine Club, a society which came into existence in 1857 for the purpose of exploring the peaks, passes and glaciers of the Alpine mountain system, at once gave an impetus to this enchanting recreation. It was not long before it was found that a new pleasure, healthful and full of adventure, had been discovered. The Alps quickly became the playground of Europe. Within comparatively easy access were ranges of mountains affording ample scope to the adventurer, and the Alpine valleys yielded any number of guides, men who were fearless and expert climbers, and almost as sure-footed as the chamois which they hunted among the rocky fastnesses. Men of widely different tastes and professions joined in the sport, and endeavoured to scale apparently inaccessible mountains, deriving pleasure from the thrilling presence of danger and the necessity of constant watchfulness. Gradually mountaineering developed and came to be recognised as an art. The sad experience of fatal accidents taught men to distinguish between the real and imaginary dangers of the Alps, and showed them that risk could be reduced to a minimum by skill and care. Of course, then as now, there were those who scornfully asked, "What is the good of it all? What is the benefit of such great exertion?" pointing out the ever-present danger of a sudden and horrible death. Vanity, they declared, was at the root of the matter. But that is not so. The charms of mountaineering are as varied and as many-sided as the mountain itself. The health-giving properties of the recreation, the necessary exercise of strength and judgment, and the pleasurable sensation of having overcome difficulties may be mentioned among the multitude of its fascinating attractions. The recreation has a moral, no less than a physical aspect. Whymper tells us that often in grappling with everyday difficulties, in apparently hopeless tasks, encouragement has been found in the remembrance of hard-won victories over stubborn Alps. That there are dangers of a very real kind it is impossible to deny, but many of them may be avoided by experience and caution. Indeed, the greater number of fatal accidents which occur are directly traceable to the neglect of measures such as ordinary prudence should suggest. Subject as the Alps are to many sudden and violent changes of weather, it is of the utmost importance that the mountaineer should understand the weather signs, and that he should be quick in thought as in action. What under normal conditions may be a safe and easy mountain becomes dangerous under a storm. Avalanches and falling rocks, sources of terrible peril, have to be encountered, and fathomless crevasses have to be crossed. There are, besides, a host of minor risks, and experience alone can tell the mountaineer how these may be wisely met. Patience, pluck, and perseverance would be no unsuitable motto for the Alpine adventurer, for these are qualities which are absolutely essential, as will be seen from the following pages. The words of one of our greatest climbers contain advice of rare preciousness to all who would attain the heights. He says, "Remember that courage and strength are naught without prudence, and that a momentary negligence may destroy the happiness of a lifetime. Do nothing in haste. Look well to each step, and, from the beginning, think what may be the end." End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The King of Mont Blanc. "If mortal man can do it, I think I can," exclaimed Jacques Belmat as he stood at the door of his cottage one evening in 1786, looking with longing eyes towards the white-headed monarch of the Alpine peaks. Belmat was a guide by profession, and his one aim and ambition for many a day had been to reach the summit of Mont Blanc and be the first man to stand on the highest point of land of the European continent. By day his mind was filled with the daring project, and at night his rest was disturbed by alternating dreams of success and failure, adventure and death. At length his state of mind became unbearable, and he determined to find out whether or not the summit was accessible. Early one morning he set off alone. As he was leaving the house, his wife asked him where he was going. "To the mountain," he replied, "and don't be alarmed if I am not back to night. I shall likely sleep up there." Not even to his wife would he at this time entrust the secret ambition of his life. With a strong staff in his hand, a sack over his shoulder, and a crust of bread and a flask of brandy in his pocket, he stalked out of Chamonix and began his perilous journey up the mountain side. Proceeding by way of the Côte and the Glacier des Bossons, he reached the three conical rocks known as the Grand Mulets in 7 hours. Here he paused for a brief rest. After a mouthful of bread and a sip of brandy, he went on again. As he advanced, he kept a sharp lookout to find some suitable place in which to spend the night, but none presented itself, and it was not till he had gone too far to retrace his steps by daylight that he was faced with the necessity of spending the night in the snow. Just then, however, he caught sight of a bare flat rock projecting through the snow. It was only 6 feet in circumference and afforded no shelter, but as it was the first likely place he had seen, and as there was little chance of him finding better accommodation farther on, he determined to make the most of it. Another morsel of bread and a mouthful of brandy formed his supper, and he sat down on the stone to await the dawn. Presently the sun sank into the west, gilding the summit of the mountain with its brilliant rays, and wrapping the valley in gloom. After a time the moon rose, pale and cloud circled, shedding a dull silvery light all around. To Belmat, exhausted as he was by his long day's exertions, sleep was out of the question. For on one side of his narrow resting place was a sheer precipice of 800 feet, into which the slightest unconscious movement might have precipitated him. As the night wore on, the moon became obscured and snow fell heavily. Belmat was drenched to the skin, and the keen wind seemed to cut through him like a knife. Colder and colder it grew. His breath froze on his handkerchief, and it was only by continually shifting his position and keeping his hands and feet in motion that he kept himself alive. The dreadful strangeness of his surroundings oppressed him with an unspeakable awe. It was not fear, for there was nothing near to make him afraid. There was neither sound nor sign of life. The muffling snow returned no answer to his call, but it was the wild, unaccountable sense of solitude which takes possession of us at times, when the nerves pass beyond control and usurp, in a manner, the function of the brain. Now and again the supreme silence was broken by the thunderous descent of an avalanche, or by the cannon-like cracking of a glacier. So the night passed. When at length day dawned, the sun rose with clouds, and Belmat saw that he would have to abandon the attempt to reach the summit. He spent the day in examining the passes and glaciers, and towards nightfall he began the descent. When darkness overtook him, he had reached a point below the ice region. Thoroughly worn out, he lay down on the ground and slept till morning. It is a marvel that he ever woke out of that sleep, for on awaking he found his clothes were frozen to his body, and he felt numb all over. It was with the utmost difficulty that he made his way down the mountain. He had nearly reached the base when he met 3 guides setting out on an expedition. Being suspicious that they were about to attempt to scale the summit, he asked them where they were going. At first they returned evasive answers, but in the end they told him in strict confidence that they were going to try to make the ascent, and asked Belmat to accompany them. "With pleasure," he replied. but I must go and see my wife first. Go slowly, I will catch you up." Fatigue was at once forgotten, and he hurried off to his cottage, told his wife to prepare him some food, changed his clothes, and went after the others. They bivouacked near the spot where he had previously spent the night, and at dawn the little party set out. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon they reached the Dôme de Goûter. Here they were joined by 2 other guides out on a similar expedition. The 2 parties united and compared notes. While they were so engaged, Belmat set out alone in the hope of finding the way to the summit. He quickly saw that the only possible path was by crossing the narrow ridge which unites the Dôme to the summit of Mont Blanc. But how was this to be done? The ridge itself was only a few inches wide, and fell away on either side into an abyss many hundreds of feet deep. There was only one way to traverse it, and Belmat did not hesitate to make the attempt. Climbing to the end, he got on to the ridge astride as if on horseback, and dragged himself along for about 1/4 mile. His farther progress was at this point stopped by a jutting out mass of ice, which he found it impossible to surmount. When he returned to the spot where he had left his party, Belmat was dismayed to find the place deserted. Disheartened by the appearance of the mountain, they had pronounced the attempt to be hopeless, and returned to the valley, as their tracks in the snow plainly showed. When the first surprise was over, the hardy mountaineer did not know whether to regret or rejoice at his desertion. The temptation to follow them was powerful, but the thought that success was nearly within his grasp nerved him to remain. He scrambled upwards for a time, slowly and painfully. The top of the mountain was now enveloped in mist, so he made up his mind not to go any farther, for he knew that even if he succeeded in reaching the summit, he would not be believed by the villagers. His next task was to seek for some place in which to spend the night, but not a single sheltered spot was to be found. He therefore decided to hurry down as far as possible before daylight failed. The memory of his previous night's experience nerved him to his utmost speed. Suddenly he became conscious that his sight was failing him, the brilliancy of the snow dazzled his eyes, and he was nearly blind. Whichever way he looked, he seemed to see nothing but large spots of blood. Unable to proceed farther, he sat down and closed his eyes. At the end of half an hour he had so far recovered that he was able to resume his descent. He had not gone more than a few hundred yards when his staff gave warning of danger, and the next instant he felt the snow sinking beneath his weight. He was on the verge of the grand crevasse. With the mechanical promptness of the man who is used to act in sudden emergency, he drew back just in time to save himself from being precipitated into the depths below. Cautiously he walked along the side of the crevasse, looking for the frail ice bridge by which he had crossed in the morning. But again his eyesight failed. When he recovered, night had set in, and there was no escape from the fearful necessity of spending the night where he was, 2,000 feet higher than on the former occasion. Covering his face with his handkerchief, he sat down on his sack. Away down in the valley, 10,000 feet below, he saw the lights in the cottages of his friends and neighbours, and as he thought of them around their warm hearths, he wondered bitterly if any one of them pitied him alone and deserted on that bleak mountain side. The intense cold deprived him of any feelings of hunger or thirst. Now and again, during a pause in the rumble and crack of avalanche or glacier, the wretched adventurer was cheered by the bark of a dog. There seemed to him to be so much companionship in the sound, so much of a home feeling, that it was welcome, and he listened eagerly for its repetition. The hours dragged slowly by. Snow fell, not in flakes, but in sharp pellets which cut him like arrows, and seemed to freeze the very marrow in his bones. A fearful heaviness seized him, and an overpowering desire to sleep took possession of him. He knew only too well that these feelings were the harbingers of death, and he struggled against them as a man who fights for his life. The sounds from the valley served to arouse his attention for a time, till one by one the lights were extinguished, and even the dog ceased barking. Then he felt as if the last link which bound him to earth had snapped. He never could tell how he lived through that night. The silence alone was enough to drive him out of his mind, and the noises made by avalanche and glacier were even more fearful than the silence they broke. Dawn again brought disappointment. The summit was shrouded in fog, so he at once descended. When he reached home, he threw himself down on the straw in the barn and slept for 24 hours. It was several weeks before he was able to get about again after his terrible experience, and during that time he had leisure to think over events, and found that his courage and perseverance had not been altogether in vain. He discovered that if the crevasses which border the Grand Plateau were once crossed, the path to the top of Mont Blanc was clear and unbroken before him. There and then he traced out the route which has been followed ever since with but little variation, and which appears beyond all doubt to be the only practical one. This secret Belmat communicated to Dr. Packard, his physician, and the two men agreed to attempt the ascent together on the first favourable opportunity. Early on the morning of the 7th of August, 1786, after many days of fog and unsuitable weather, Belmat looked out of his cottage window and saw that the hour for the great venture had arrived. Dressing himself, he hurried to Packard's house and asked if he was ready to risk the journey. The doctor replied that he was ready for anything. The day was spent in making arrangements. Belmat was calm as usual, but the doctor wavered between delirious excitement and childish fear, which he tried in vain to hide. More than once he urged Belmat to take a couple of guides with them, but the pioneer firmly refused, saying, "If you cannot trust yourself with me, stay at home. I will go alone." Their preparations were of the simplest description, consisting only of a couple of blankets, a small quantity of food, and some syrup to mix with the water. Neither brandy nor wine was included on this occasion, for Belmat had found in his previous expeditions that the alcohol had done him more harm than good. About 5 o'clock they started, leaving the village by different routes so as not to arouse the curiosity of the people. The first night was passed on the mountain side in comparative comfort, and at 2 o'clock next morning the two adventurers resumed their journey. All went well for a time till they approached an immense glacier, the sight of which filled the doctor with apprehension. His fears of the day before returned with double force, and he would gladly have abandoned the expedition. Man has always invested the unknown with imaginary terrors, and the doctor was no exception. The difficulties of the route increased. Immense crevasses had to be crossed on narrow ice bridges, which creaked beneath their feet, and on which a momentary carelessness meant death. For a time Packard was completely unnerved. The confidence of his guide, however, reassured him, and again he went boldly forward. After they had passed the Grand Mulets, Belmat pointed out the rock on which he had passed the first night, and again the doctor was ready to sink with an ungovernable fright. At the same moment, to add to his consternation, a sudden gust of wind sent his hat skimming over the precipice. So fierce indeed was the blast that the two men had to throw themselves on their faces, and as they lay there were in imminent danger of being buried under the huge masses of snow which the tempest tossed hither and thither. By crawling on their hands and knees they managed to make their way to the Dôme du Goûter. Here the doctor utterly collapsed and refused to go a step farther. Belmat used the utmost persuasion at his command in a vain attempt to nerve him to continue the journey. Not another inch would Packard advance. Leaving his companion comfortably wrapped in his blanket, with orders to keep awake, the hardy mountaineer set off alone. He found the way much easier than he anticipated, but he experienced great difficulty in breathing, owing to the rarefaction of the air. Every few yards he had to stop to recover his breath, and he felt as if he had no lungs. His symptoms were becoming alarming, when the happy thought came to him of tying his handkerchief over his mouth. This gave him instant relief, and with head down, in face of the cold and the bitter wind, he pressed forward. Suddenly he was conscious of having reached the highest point anywhere around him. He lifted his head and stared about him. Yes! At last his reward had come. He found himself standing on the top of Mont Blanc. We can but faintly conceive the rush of thoughts and emotions which passed through the mind of the hardy guide at this moment. More than once he looked around in dread expectation that there might be another peak of greater altitude, but his apprehension was groundless. Every other mountain top lay far below him. Away down in the valley he could see that the inhabitants of Chamonix had assembled to greet the conqueror of the Monarch of the mountains. All were there, toddling children and tottering old men and women, waving their hats and handkerchiefs in wild delight. The sight was more than sufficient recompense for all his toil and fatigue and disappointment. His triumph was complete. Even then Belmat was not unmindful of his friend the doctor, so after another hasty glance round, to make assurance doubly sure that he had reached the summit, he descended. When he reached the spot where he had left Packard, he found him lying huddled together and apparently dead. Belmat hastily roused him and shouted in his ear the joyful news, "I have been to the top of Mont Blanc." Instead of a word of congratulation, there came a querulous request to be left alone and allowed to go to sleep. "Sleep?" exclaimed Belmat. "You didn't come here to sleep, but to go to the top of the mountain. I have been up, and you must come too." With considerable difficulty the guide got Packard onto his feet, but he was in such a death-like stupor that he did not care what became of him. Belmat's vigorous pushing in time restored some slight animation, and they eventually reached the summit. With enthusiasm the guide pointed out the various features of the magnificent panorama which lay unfolded before their eyes. His words fell on deaf ears. The doctor was as one dead. So, with a final wave of his hat to those below, Belmat began the descent, and a fearful descent it was. Packard had now lost all power of voluntary movement, and it was only by force that the guide got him along, pushing him in the good places and carrying him on his back in the bad. The excitement alone of this performance kept Belmat up, and about 11 o'clock at night they reached the solid ground below the ice region. For an hour they had been travelling in the dark. When Belmat was wrapping the doctor in his blanket, he found that the unfortunate man had temporarily lost the use of both hands, benumbed by the intense cold, a circumstance to which he was perfectly indifferent. The guide himself had lost the use of one hand, so that there was only one hand between them. However, a vigorous rubbing with snow soon restored the circulation, and after a little supper they stretched themselves on the ground and went to sleep. About 6 o'clock next morning Belmat was awakened by the doctor, who remarked, "What a strange thing! It's quite dark, yet the birds are singing. It's broad daylight. Open your eyes." "I don't think I can, for I see nothing." Belmat looked at his companion, and to his surprise saw that his eyes were wide open. The poor fellow was blind. They at once set off for home, and the guide managed to get Packard to his house in safety. He then hurried to his own cottage. When he looked at himself in the glass, he was horrified to see that his face was black, his eyes red, and his lips blue. If he smiled or yawned, the blood spurted out from his cheeks and lips, and for long afterwards he could only see in the twilight. Beyond this, he was little the worse for his daring adventure, and the doctor, after a time, completely recovered his sight. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Early Adventures on Mont Blanc. The news of Belmat's successful ascent of Mont Blanc quickly spread over Europe, and reached the ears of Horace de Saussure, Professor of Natural Philosophy in the College of Geneva. For 27 years it had been the dream of his life to reach the summit of Mont Blanc and make scientific observations. But the idea that the mountain was inaccessible had always held him back from the attempt. Now his chance had come, and he lost no time in taking advantage of it. In July 1787 he arrived at Chamounix, intending to start at once, but unsuitable weather delayed him for several weeks, and it was not until the 1st of August that the attempt could be made. With 18 guides and a personal servant he set out, taking with him a number of scientific instruments, a tent, and a large quantity of provisions. The first night was spent at the foot of the mountain, and the next day they ascended a considerable distance. The cold was so intense that some of the guides declared it would be fatal to spend the night at such an elevation. The tent was, however, pitched in the snow, and all crowded into it. After a time the atmosphere became so oppressive that de Saussure went out to breathe. The moon, he says, was shining brilliantly in the middle of a jet black sky. It was a scene of the most solemn and majestic magnificence. Early next morning the march was resumed, and after many hours of laborious scrambling the summit was gained. While de Saussure enjoyed the view spread out below and around him, the guides fixed up the tent and arranged his instruments. But when he attempted to use them he experienced the greatest difficulty with his breathing, owing to the rarefaction of the air. Over and over again he was compelled to rest and pant as much as if he had ascended one of the steepest slopes. For 3 hours and a half he persevered, but at last his sufferings became so intense that he had to give up without having made all the observations he desired. The descent was accordingly begun and accomplished in safety. By this ascent the Professor earned for himself the title of Father of Mountaineering. He was the first man who had braved the dangers of the Alps in the cause of science. To Marie Paradis, a native of Chamounix, belongs the proud distinction of having been the first woman to make the ascent of the Great White Mountain. She was only 22 years of age. For a long time her great desire had been to follow in the footsteps of Belmat, and she tried to persuade some of the guides to accompany her, but in vain. Each and all of them absolutely refused, and plainly told her that she could not be in her right senses to dream of such an adventure. At length, in 1809, she succeeded in winning over a guide named Victor Terraz, who showed her the way to the summit. Many years later this feat was emulated by another lady, a Swiss, named Mademoiselle de Gerville, who, with 4 guides, set out on the 4th of September 1838. She was of a delicate but highly excitable temperament, and during the ascent she behaved with the utmost courage. When the summit was reached, she ordered the guides to lift her up on their shoulders, so that she might say she had been higher than anyone else, higher even than Mont Blanc. On the morning of the 31st of July 1856, an Englishman named Foreman and his daughter added to the number of successful ascents. They arrived at the Grand Mulets at 3 in the afternoon. Here the night was spent, and at 2 o'clock on the following morning they resumed the ascent by the light of lanterns. A climb of 8 hours took them to the summit. After resting half an hour, the descent was commenced, and Chamounix was reached in safety at 7 o'clock. "This ascent," says a contemporary notice, "will be talked of as one of the wonders of the valley, both on account of the short time employed, 15 hours to ascend and 7 to descend, and of the intrepidity shown by Miss Foreman. Their progress was eagerly watched during the whole day, and every window that commanded a view of the path was bristling with telescopes, like muskets from a loophole. The arrival at Chamounix was a perfect triumph, the whole population turning out to meet them. A display of fireworks brought a most exciting day to a close." In following the story of the giant mountain, we now pass over a few uneventful ascents, and come to a series of accidents. In 1864 a guide who refused to be roped broke through the thin snow layer which concealed a mighty crevasse, and lost his life. One of his companions was lowered by a rope and descended to a depth of 80 feet without discovering any trace of the unfortunate man. A bottle was then let down 200 feet into the abyss, and on being pulled up was found to be encased in ice. The body was never recovered. 2 years later, Captain Arkwright ascended, in company with his sister and 2 guides, to the Grand Mulets. Here the lady decided to await her brother's return, and he pushed on. Some time afterwards she heard the report of an avalanche, but she did not associate it with any danger to the climbers. Little did she think that, at that very moment, the relentless foe of the Alpine adventurer was sweeping her brother and one of the guides into a crevasse, from which they would never return, or that the other guide was fighting hard for life, and only escaped as by a miracle. But when he returned alone, the whole truth burst upon her, and she read the awful story in the wild look of terror on his face. One can well imagine the terrible scene which ensued on the side of the pitiless mountain. The first woman who fell a victim to the perils of the mountain was the wife of an American named Mark, who, in company with his wife and her sister, Miss Wilkinson, attempted the ascent on the 2nd of August 1870. They passed the Grand Mulets in safety, and for a time all went well. Then the ladies complained of fatigue, and expressed a desire to turn back. Mark was, however, bent on reaching the summit, so he put them into the charge of a young porter, and continued the climb. He had not advanced far when he was startled by a piercing scream, and on looking back saw Miss Wilkinson wringing her hands at the side of the crevasse, into which her sister and the porter had fallen. Their bodies were never recovered. Later on in the same disastrous year, a Scottish minister named M'Corkindale and two American gentlemen named Randall and Bean reached the summit, accompanied by 3 guides and 5 porters. Suddenly a cloud descended, and the mountain was wrapped in fog. Then a terrible storm came on, and for 8 days it raged with unprecedented fury. In the valley, great anxiety was felt for those on the mountain, but in the face of the tempest the most skilful guides could not have ascended, so there was nothing to be done but to hope for the best. On the 9th day a search party went out. Near the summit they came on 10 bodies lying in the snow as if asleep. All were frozen to death. Of the 11th man no trace was found. Probably he had attempted to make his way down and had fallen into a crevasse. By the side of Bean was found a diary in which he had written a last message to his wife. The entries were short and eloquently pathetic. The last one read as follows: "We are without food. My feet are already frozen, and I am dying. I have only strength to write a few more words. I die with faith in God, and my last thoughts are of you." From the contemplation of so fearful a tragedy, let us now turn to the ascent of Miss Mary Isabella Stratton, which took place in the winter of 1876. Accompanied by 2 guides and 2 porters, she started from Chamounix on the 28th of January and arrived safely at the Grand Mulets. Favoured by fine weather, on the following day she might have reached the summit had not one of the porters fallen into a crevasse and injured himself so severely that a return to the Grand Mulets was deemed imperative. On the following day the man was sent down to the valley. About 4 o'clock on the morning of the 31st a start was again made. The weather was magnificent, clear and calm, but very cold. As she ascended the cold increased and the wind began to blow strongly. Presently a halt had to be made, for 2 of the daring lady's fingers were frostbitten, and it was not until they had been vigorously rubbed with snow for nearly an hour that the guides would allow her to proceed. Meanwhile the wind had increased in fury and was whirling the snow hither and thither in clouds. With dauntless perseverance she struggled forward, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon reached the summit. When we read that the thermometer showed 10 degrees below zero, we can form an idea of the courage that was needed to achieve that result. After enjoying the view, which the intrepid lady tells us was magnificent beyond all anticipation, the return journey was commenced. She reached the Grand Mulets at 7 o'clock, and on the following day returned with her guides to Chamounix, having accomplished a feat unique in the annals of Mont Blanc. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Engulfed in the snow. A fatal attempt to reach the summit of Mont Blanc was made in the year 1820 by Dr. Hamel. He was employed by the Emperor of Russia to make some important observations, in course of which he determined to ascend Mont Blanc. His party consisted of a Geneva optician named Seligue, two Englishmen, Durnford and Henderson, and 12 guides. When they started, the weather was clear and gave promise of a pleasant and successful journey. But from the first, misfortune followed them. They had not gone very far when one of the guides swallowed some sulphuric acid in mistake for syrup of vinegar. Fortunately there was a house at hand, from which the doctor obtained some wood ashes, mixed them with water, and made the guide swallow it, and so saved his life. The Grand Mulets was reached in safety after a day's march. Here the guides made a rude tent with their batons and blankets. Hardly had the adventurers got under cover when a dreadful thunderstorm came on and continued during the greater part of the night. When day broke, the weather was still so bad that it was deemed imprudent to advance, and 2 guides were sent back to Chamonix for more provisions. On the following morning, however, the weather cleared and the guides were eager to proceed. With the exception of Seligue, all the party shared their ardour. He declared that he had had enough of mountaineering, and that his desire for adventure was quite satisfied by passing 2 nights perched on a crag like an eagle. His companions tried to persuade him to continue, but without avail. He would go back to Geneva, so they agreed to let him have his way, and told 2 guides who had not made the ascent before to accompany him. The ascent was then resumed. The weather was most suitable, and their progress was rapid. Shortly after 8 o'clock they halted on the Grand Plateau for breakfast, but none of the party could eat much. The end of their journey was in sight, and they were too excited to think of anything but reaching the summit. In less than half an hour they were off again. The glorious weather, the marvellous stillness which reigned around, and the pure air they breathed, gave birth in their souls to feelings which they had never experienced in lower regions. As the rest of the party were crossing a long snow slope, the snow suddenly gave way beneath their feet, and they were all quickly carried down the slope. What happened after that may be best described in the words of Durnford. While endeavouring to regain my footing, the snow above us rushed into the gap that had been made, and completed the catastrophe by burying us all at once in its mass, and hurrying us downwards towards 2 crevasses about 1/4 of a mile below. The accumulation of snow instantly threw me backwards, and I was carried down in spite of all my struggles, and my pole was forced out of my hands. In a couple of minutes I emerged, but so far from being alive to the danger of our position, that on seeing 3 of my companions some distance below me sitting motionless and silent up to the waist in snow, I was about to make a jesting remark, till a second glance showed me that the other members of the party were nowhere to be seen. Others, however, soon emerged from the mass, and I was still inclined to treat the matter as a perplexing though ludicrous delay, than in the light of a serious accident. I was quickly brought to my senses by one of the guides calling out that some of the party were lost, pointing at the same time to the crevasse into which he said they had fallen. Then we saw that 5 of the guides were missing. We were soon gladdened by seeing two of them make their appearance. One of them had been thrown into a narrow part of the crevasse and had managed to scramble out. The other had been dragged up by his companion, quite senseless, and nearly black from the weight of snow which had fallen on him, but he quickly recovered. 3 were now missing, and we refused to believe that they were past hope. We searched in every direction, fathoming the loose snow with our poles, all in vain. Gradually the horrible conviction forced itself upon us, accompanied by the sad reflection, I have caused the death of these brave fellows. But no, it was impossible that they should be dead. Even if they had been swept into the crevasse, it was no reason why they should not turn up presently as the others had done. To the crevasse we returned and descended upon the newly fallen snow. Happily it did not give way beneath our weight. Here we continued above a quarter of an hour, making every exertion in our power for the recovery of our poor comrades. We sheltered, in the fond hope that they might still be alive, sheltered by some projection of the icy walls of the crevasse. But alas! all was silent as the grave, and we had too much reason to fear that they were long since insensible, and probably at a vast depth beneath the snow on which we stood. When the sad truth burst upon us, our feelings may be conceived. They cannot be expressed. All thought of reaching the summit was now abandoned. One of the guides, an old soldier, proposed that the ascent should be continued, but no one had the heart to go on. The sole wish of all was to return as quickly as possible. With many a backward glance, in the vain hope of seeing their comrades reappear, the descent was begun. A sad and silent march of 3 hours brought them again to the Grand Mulets. After a short rest they moved forward again. Darkness came on, but they still kept on their melancholy way, and at length arrived at Chamonix, where they told the pitiful tale of disaster and death. After this fatal attempt, the snows of Mont Blanc remained untrodden for 2 years. The sequel to this thrilling adventure was furnished 41 years later in the following remarkable manner. On the 15th of August 1861, a Chamonix guide arrived at the house of the mayor. He was travel-stained and weary, and carried on his shoulders a sack, which, when it was opened, was found to contain human remains. The man stated that he had found them at the tongue of the Glacier de Bossons, which entered the valley from Mont Blanc. Inquiries were instituted, and an examination was held. It was then proved beyond doubt that these were the bodies of the guides who had perished in the crevasse in 1820. The surviving guides had readily identified them. Their flesh was in a perfect state of preservation, as were also their hats and clothes. Even a leg of mutton, which one of the guides had carried, was quite fresh, but went bad on being exposed to the air. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5 weeks buried. For 3 days the snow had fallen continuously, and the few houses at Bergamoletto were nearly crushed and buried by the drifts. On the fourth day, however, the 19th of March 1755, the weather cleared, and Joseph Rokier and his son went out to clear away the snow and shovel it from the roof of their house. They were so busily engaged in their task that they did not hear a terrific noise as of the discharge of a salvo of artillery. Suddenly they were startled by a shout from a man who was passing below. "Are you deaf there?" he cried. "An avalanche is coming down the mountain in your direction. Get down quickly, or you will be overtaken." Father and son did not need a second bidding. They jumped from the roof and fled precipitately down the road in panic. When the first terror seizure was over, Rokier bethought himself of his wife and family, who were indoors and totally unconscious of their swift approaching doom. He turned back to warn them, but it was too late. Just then, with a roar and a crash, the moving mountain of snow swept down on the cottage and engulfed it. Unnerved as the man already was, it is not to be wondered at that he sank senseless on the snow at the sight of the sudden and appalling catastrophe. When consciousness returned, he and his son made their way to the house of a friend some miles away, where he told the sad story that his wife, sister and 2 children had perished in the avalanche. His wife's brother, however, judging from his condition of abject terror, was not prepared to accept his statements, and insisted that they should return to the scene of the disaster and see if it was not possible to rescue the women and children. They accordingly set out. After a long search, and when many openings had been made in the snow, they were unable to find any trace of the cottage. The brother was satisfied that the husband's worst fears had been realised. All further exploration was abandoned till the spring, when they intended to make an attempt to recover the bodies for burial. During the next few weeks the sun was unusually hot, and under its influence the snow softened and melted to a large extent. Towards the end of April, Rokier started for Bergamoletto. He found that there was still an enormous mass lying on the site of his home, but it was in such a condition that it might be penetrated without very great difficulty. He therefore set to work, but before he had done much, darkness came on. Next morning, while he was digging, he was joined by his wife's brother. This man, who lived at De Monts, had a dream on the previous night, in which his sister appeared before him and begged him to come to Bergamoletto and rescue her from under the snow. He was so greatly impressed by the vision that he at once started. He now proposed to assist Rokier in his search. The 2 men went to work with a will, and in a remarkably short time they reached the house. With mingled feelings of hope and apprehension they entered. No sound broke the stillness. Everything was as it had been left on that dreadful day. Here and there they looked. Not a corner was passed without examination, but no trace of the missing persons could be found. "What does it mean?" they asked each other in awestruck whispers. For a time they stood rooted to the spot. Was it possible that the women had left the house and been overtaken by the avalanche? Suddenly Rokier, whose mind seems to have been slightly unhinged since the day of the disaster, remembered that the women and children had gone to the stable, about 300 yards away, to feed the goats some little time before he went on to the roof. In desperation they again set to work. A passage had nearly been opened when they heard a faint voice crying, "Help! My dear brother, help!" The sound of life put fresh vigour into their arms, and they attacked the snow barrier with redoubled fury. At length an opening was made, and the brother descended, while the husband ran off to procure help. Tenderly the wife, sister, and one child were lifted out alive and carried to a neighbour's house. They were little more than living skeletons, and for a time neither of the women were expected to live. Judicious care and attention pulled them out of danger, but for many a day their pinched faces and anxious eyes told more eloquently than words the story of their terrible experience. As Rokia said, his wife had gone with her sister and the two children, a boy and a girl, to the stable to feed the goats, which were shut up there along with an ass and several fowls. She was about to return to the house for something she had forgotten, when she happened to look towards the mountain and saw a huge mass of snow falling in the direction of the house. She at once went back and shut the door. In a few minutes the whole building was shaken by the violence of the shock, and they heard the roof creak over their heads. Instinctively they rushed to the manger, which stood near the main support of the building, and it was well that they did so, for soon afterwards part of the roof fell in. When the noise of the falling mass had ceased, they called loudly for help, but no voice could have penetrated so great a depth of snow. The only food they had was a few chestnuts. Two of these and a drink of melted snow formed their breakfast on the first day. Next morning the nuts were finished, and then, had it not been for the two goats, they would certainly have died of starvation. These animals gave about a quart of milk a day at first, but as time went on this quantity greatly diminished. Recognising that their lives depended on those of the goats, they took special care to feed the animals. Over the manger was a hay loft, and the sister pulled down hay for them as long as she could reach it, and then the goats climbed on to her shoulders and helped themselves. After the first few days all feeling of hunger passed away, and the milk of the goats satisfied their needs. Daily their position became more dreadful. Not a streak of light entered their prison, and it was only by the crowing of the fowls that they were able to mark the slow passage of time. On the 6th day the boy became ill. For a week he lay in his mother's arms night and day, till death put an end to his sufferings. Then the ass died, and one by one the fowls dropped off their perch and were heard no more. Day and night was now alike to them as they sat huddled together waiting for deliverance. The melted snow dripped down on them in icy drops. The air of the place was foul to an almost insupportable degree, and the prospect of rescue seemed remote enough, but never for a moment did they despair. Throughout everything they felt that they would not be forsaken, and the wife was confident that her brother would be their deliverer. Strangely enough, The rescue came about just in the manner she had expected. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Adventures on the Schreckhorn. Eustace Anderson, accompanied by 2 guides and porters, set out from Grindelwald on the 5th of August 1857 to climb the Schreckhorn. They started about 10 o'clock in the morning and proceeded leisurely at first. They had not gone very far when Anderson thought that a light ladder might be of service to him, so he dispatched one of the porters for one. Passing along by meadows in which the haymakers were busy at work, they ascended in the direction of a far-off patch of snow. The sun shone brightly, and the song of the peasants in the fields was heard distinctly through the clear, still air. Gradually, as the distance increased, the sounds became more faint, till the travellers reached the snow patch and rounded a corner of rock, when the singing completely died away. The sudden stillness was most remarkable, and produced in the climbers a feeling of depression, which did not wear off till the difficulties of the path demanded their attention and gave their thoughts full occupation. As they made their way along the side of a glacier, they heard the sound of falling water, and in a short time came upon a number of cascades, which thundered down among the rocks with deafening roar to the glacier below, which bore unmistakable evidences of the continuous weight of water which poured down upon it from the melting snows above. A long detour would now have been necessary had they not brought the ladder with them. As they were fixing it, a stone fell, and, as always happens, it was followed by a perfect shower, which flew past them dangerously near. The ladder was quickly put in position, and the whole party crossed. A stone struck the edge of Anderson's hat while he was ascending the opposite slope, and one of the porters was struck on the head with considerable force. Blood flowed freely from the wound, and it was necessary to call a halt. Restoratives were applied, and after a brief rest the man was able to continue the ascent, though very badly shaken. In a few hours they reached the Chief Hotel. This was a number of rocks thrown together in such a way as they formed a rude cave, the entrance to which was by a narrow opening near the ground. Here they decided to spend the night. Anderson, however, did not relish the idea of being an inhabitant of the Chief Hotel, so, rolling himself in his blanket, he lay down in the open with his knapsack for a pillow, and slept soundly for several hours. Shortly after midnight he was awakened by a deep-toned thunder peal, and in a few minutes rain fell heavily. Bundling his blanket and knapsack together, he was glad to take shelter in the cave, which he found more commodious and comfortable than he had anticipated. Next morning the rain still continued, and the greater part of the day was spent in the Chief Hotel. About 2 o'clock the sky brightened, and they ascended some distance and took up their quarters under an overhanging rock. A fire was lighted and supper prepared. Then the guides and porters betook themselves to niches in the rock, leaving their master, wrapped in his blanket, sitting by the fire. The night was bitterly cold, and rain fell heavily, so that all were glad when day dawned and preparations were made for starting. A steep and lofty glacier crowned cliff lay in their path, an apparently insuperable obstacle. A careful search, however, revealed a spot where the rock was slightly worn away by the action of the ice. Towards this they directed their energies, and after a tough climb reached the glacier above. It was cut into innumerable sections by crevasses of great magnificence, and presented a most remarkable spectacle. Here much time was spent, for owing to these gigantic fissures they had frequently to turn back and strike out in another direction. This delay was most tantalising, as the summit of the mountain seemed to be quite within reach. After repeated failures they finally struck the proper route and entered a valley of snow, from which Anderson, looking upward, saw two peaks. Turning to his guide, he asked the name of the nearer one. "Schreckhorn," was the reply. "And the farther one is called?" he enquired. "Schreckhorn too. So the mountain has two summits and not one, as appears from below?" "That is so, sir," replied the guides, "and the more distant peak is about 200 feet higher." Anderson, therefore, naturally decided to attempt to scale the higher summit, and the party struck off in its direction. But a gigantic crevasse brought them to an abrupt halt. What was to be done? Right and left they went in a vain endeavour to find a suitable place for crossing. So they determined to bring their ladder into use. They mounted to the edge of the crevasse, and a few minutes more would have seen them on the other side. Just then, however, an avalanche of new snow moved down the slope opposite with a gentle hissing sound. As its momentum increased, the hissing became a dull roar, accompanied by a crunching noise as the snow packed together into gigantic blocks. The greater part went over the crevasse, while the remainder flowed over them in a steady stream. Anderson stuck his axe into the snow, and, crouching down on his knees, held on for dear life. It was indeed a fortunate circumstance that they had not reached the opposite side, for then nothing could have saved them. Even as it was, the snow that was left poured over them so continuously that they were nearly suffocated. The moment that the movement ceased, Anderson pulled himself out. His pockets were filled with snow. Large blocks of it rested on his shoulders, and smaller pieces clung to every part of his clothing. His companions were in a similar state. Hardly had they knocked the snow from their clothes and emptied it out of their pockets, when another avalanche descended, which was fought in the same way as the first. When it ceased, the adventurers seized their ladder and retreated. The mountain was evidently not in a humour to allow itself to be assailed with impunity. Descending a gentle slope, they reached the valley which lay between the peaks, and directed their steps towards a cluster of rocks on the opposite side. A third avalanche rumbled down. On this occasion they were out of its path, but it passed so near that Anderson touched it with the end of his axe. This avalanche was the cause of an amusing incident, which helped to brighten the disappointed climbers, and infused fresh vigour into their weary limbs. One of the porters came along with the ladder on his head, paying very little attention to the ground over which he walked. Into the tail of the expiring avalanche he strode, and the same moment he was tossed off his feet and rolled over and over, clinging tightly to the ladder. He soon regained his feet and was none the worse for his terrifying experience. Leaving the ladder behind, the whole party now pressed forward with all haste to the rocks, to be out of the reach of avalanches. The axes were brought into play and steps were cut till the frost-broken rock was reached, which afforded good foothold. A stiff climb brought them to the summit, which was reached at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. An extempore flag was hoisted at a height of over 13,000 feet. After a brief rest, the gathering clouds warned them that it was time to make their way down again before the storm came on. A consultation was held, when it was decided to attempt the descent by the opposite side. A start was accordingly made. Down the precipitous side of the peak they crawled as best they could. Everywhere was rock, gloomy, sterile, bare rock. Anderson found that he got on best by placing his hands behind him and creeping down on all fours with his back to the rock. One of the guides, who disdained this mode of locomotion, said to him, "This is granite, sir. One never slips on granite." But Anderson refused to abandon his undignified attitude, and before they had gone much farther, the guide did slip, fortunately without sustaining any injury. Continuing the descent, they reached the summit of a precipice so smooth and steep that it offered not the slightest prospect of descent. A return would have to be made, but not before a thorough examination had taken place, and the last chance, no matter how wild, had been seen to be impracticable. Peering round a projecting rock, Anderson saw a ledge on the other side which led downwards, and he made up his mind to reach it if possible. This was the most perilous adventure of the whole expedition. The precipice went straight down some hundreds of feet, and it required a very strong head to enable one to look into the depths below. To add to the risk of the exploit, the men were not roped, and the slightest slip would have proved fatal. Clinging to the projecting rock with both hands, he essayed the fearful risk, while he groped about with his foot to find standing room. He succeeded, and the others followed his daring example with equal good fortune. Before the descent was accomplished, rain fell in torrents, and they reached home drenched to the skin. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To the summit of the Weisshorn. Many had been the attempts by daring and skilful mountaineers to scale the colossal three-faced pyramid of rock known as the Weisshorn, but all had failed. And as time went on, the people in the little village of Randa at its foot came to regard the mountain as invincible. Thither, in 1861, came Professor Tyndall, the well-known physicist, who announced his intention of taking the summit by assault. He was in anything but a fit condition physically for so formidable a venture, and those at the hotel looked on him with pity not unmixed with scorn when they heard of the errand on which he had come. He had, however, made up his mind, and no arguments could persuade him to desist. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of the 18th of August he set out, accompanied by two trusty guides, Bennen and Wenger, who had already made an examination of the mountain to find out the most practicable route to the summit. As they made their way through the pines which fringed the lower slopes, the Professor was tormented by an insatiable thirst, and he found considerable difficulty in keeping up with his companions. Struggling upward for some time at length brought them to a suitable place for resting, and here they decided to spend the night. When they came to make the tea, they found that it was green, so coffee was decided on. Then another difficulty presented itself. As in the case of the Ancient Mariner, there was water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. The rushing of a river could be heard away in the distance, but it was not easy to locate it among the boulders of ice-covered rock. One of the guides set out to try to find the stream, and returned successful after a short absence. Coffee was then made, and the Professor got into his sleeping bag, 2 pairs of rugs sewn together, for the night. Next morning Tyndall and his guides were astir at 2:15, and waited impatiently for daylight. At length a brightness in the east was seen, and the day began with every prospect of good weather. They left their camping ground about 3:30, and as they ascended they saw clearly that if their attempt turned out a failure they could not blame the weather. Rounding a shoulder of the mountain they reached a snowfield, which they crossed without any difficulty, then across a glacier. Here they came upon one of the finest imaginable pieces of nature's sculpture. The rocks were hewn into queer looking turrets and pillars, scattered confusedly about, interspersed with colossal chips, which looked as though they had been knocked off by some giant hand in the carving. The ascent now became more laborious. The peculiar path called into exercise every muscle of the body, but in spite of the great exertion Tyndall felt stronger than when he had set out. At the end of 2 hours' climbing a halt was made, and they turned round to look at the way they had come, when 2 dark objects on the glacier below attracted their attention. A second look showed them to be a couple of men following as quickly as possible in Tyndall's footsteps, and taking full advantage of the steps his men had cut in the glacier. It was only what might have been expected. The Professor's expedition had aroused the greatest interest at Randa, and the most expert mountaineers had begged to be allowed to join, but all were refused. It was therefore only natural that these two, more adventurous perhaps than the rest, should try the ascent independently, and it was just possible that they might succeed in sharing the honour if the original party failed to win it. After a short rest, Tyndall resumed his journey. Ascending a rough sort of natural staircase, they reached the flat summit of a tower. Their farther progress in this direction seemed to be impossible, for a huge gap had been cut out of the mountain, and there was apparently no way of reaching the tower on the opposite side. But, as Tyndall says, it is wonderful how many ways out of a difficulty there are open to a man who diligently seeks them. Bennen carefully surveyed the place, and declared it was easy to descend. Coiling the rope round his waist, he was lowered by his companions over the cliff till he reached a narrow ledge. Here he waited until the Professor joined him, and then Wenger followed. In a few minutes the difficulty was overcome, and they reached the tower by a series of turns and twists, and gained the ridge behind it. The path was still toilsome, and to spare their strength as much as possible they turned their backs on the ridge and made their way along the southern slope of the mountain. Here ice had accumulated in considerable quantities, and nearly every step had to be cut. This was slow and tiring work, so they again returned to the ridge. When they had gone some distance, the path became gradually narrower and narrower, till it was no wider than the top of a wall, from which awful precipices dropped sheer down on either side. Again, however, the intrepid Bennen discovered a way. Pressing the snow with his foot, he found that it became quite solid, and though the foot space was not 6 inches wide, he crossed in safety by walking with his toes out, like one who walks on the tight-rope. His companions followed in his tracks, and reached the other side without mishap. This was a feat of which Bennen was justly proud, as well he might be, when we remember that the distance traversed was about 20 yards. As they continued the ascent, they had to proceed with the utmost caution, on account of the loose nature of the rocks. Several times vast masses of stone were dislodged, and touching others as they descended, set them also in motion. And so whole troops went thundering down with an almost continuous roar. The summit was hidden from sight by intervening peaks, and as they mounted from one to another, it came more clearly into view, and they tried to estimate the distance they still had to climb. In this they were often the victims of strange illusions. 5 hours after starting, they seemed so near that they thought themselves sure of success, and hurried forward to achieve their triumph. But an hour later the peak seemed farther off than ever. No wonder that the mountain had so long remained unconquered. Even Bennen was disappointed, and Wenger was distressed as much by the elusive peak as by the arduous climb. The heat was fearful, and Tyndall felt as if he was in a Turkish bath. There was scarcely a position into which it is possible to contort the body that they had not exercised. During the forenoon the fingers and wrists were our main reliance, and, as a mechanical instrument, the human hand appeared to me this day in a light which it had never assumed before. It is a miracle of constructive art. Again and again did the Professor jump from point to point, and test his strength in other ways, lest some sudden emergency might arise and find him unequal to the strain. For he had determined to turn back the moment the slightest token of exhaustion manifested itself. A peak now hid the summit from their view, and they pressed forward, confident that the end of their climb lay just beyond. They scaled the height, but to their consternation the top of the Weisshorn lay far beyond, at an apparently hopeless distance. Despair took possession of them. The guides lay down in the snow with looks of utter despondency in their eyes, and Tyndall suggested that they should at once retrace their steps. His words instantly aroused Benin, who declared emphatically that he would not turn back. "We must win him," he said, meaning the mountain. Those few words were significant of the man's invincible determination. After a short rest and some food, they went forward again. After a long and difficult climb, another peak was surmounted, and there, within comparatively easy access, stood the silvery pyramid, projected against the blue sky. Defeat was now impossible, and they pressed forward with renewed energy. Quickly they crossed the intervening space, and at the end of the ridge reached a large prism of granite, from which a knife edge of pure snow ran up to a little point. They passed along the edge and reached the point, and the summit of the Weisshorn was won. The adventurers stood at a height of 14,831 feet above the sea. Almost their first act was to look for the whereabouts of the two men who were following them. They were toiling upwards, but hundreds of feet below. The guides gave vent to their feelings in a wild cheer. Their rivals heard, looked up, and, seeing that their chances of success were gone, turned and descended to Randa, where they spread the news of Tyndall's success to an unbelieving and scornful audience. For a time Tyndall was lost in contemplation of the marvellous panorama of peak and glacier which was spread around him on all sides. He was brought to himself by a complaint from Benin, who regretted that they had not brought any means by which they could record their presence on the summit to future climbers. This was, however, easily remedied. The head was taken off an ice axe, and a red handkerchief was tied to the handle, which was firmly planted on the summit. The ascent had occupied 10 hours, and though they anticipated an easy descent, they judged that it was now time to start. Benin took the lead, and before they had gone very far, they saw that the return would be fully as tedious and even more perilous than the upward journey. Slowly each crag and cliff had to be negotiated. Benin would drop down to a convenient ledge, and when he obtained a footing, the Professor descended, and then Wenger followed in turn. During the ascent not a word of warning had been spoken, but now the caution, "Take care not to slip," was repeated over and over again. And, indeed, it was most necessary that he who thought he stood should take heed lest he fell, for on the treacherous ice slopes a single false step would have precipitated one down the side at such speed that it would have been impossible to stop. During the descent, Benin proved himself to be an excellent and steady guide. At one point, as he was lowered cautiously over the face of the rock, he cautioned his companions to be still and not to move until he gave the word. The rock was certainly steep, but to the Professor's eye it presented no features of unusual difficulty, and he wondered at the reason of so much carefulness. It was not till he descended in turn and found Benin on a small rounded projection with no more than sufficient footing, that he understood. Any unexpected movement would have thrown him down, and he would most likely have drawn his companions after him. Presently they were startled by the loud report of a huge rock crashing down the mountain side. Another and another followed, till there were fully 100 of these ungovernable and terrible missiles in full flight on all sides of them. The noise was deafening, and as they struck against the permanent rocks, the report of the concussion was accompanied by a bright flash, which heightened the similarity of the occurrence to a discharge of cannon. So far they had been able to descend without interruption, but now a precipice barred the way, and a long detour had to be made before a place was discovered sufficiently sloping to allow them to pass downwards. Some distance farther on, a second precipice was encountered, which necessitated another long roundabout. Tyndall had given up all hope of their being able to circumvent the barrier, and was on the point of advising a retreat, when the practised eye of Benin caught sight of a point where the cliff was less steep. The polished surface of the rock was broken by a narrow fissure which sloped downwards towards the lower glacier. "Here we shall descend," said the guide. He grasped the rock, and with his fingers firmly placed in the crack, he worked his body along till he was near enough to the glacier to allow himself to slide down in safety. The other two followed him, and they started across the ice at a good pace. Presently they were confronted by a third precipice, more awful than the other two. The Professor had reached that stage of exhaustion which induces complete indifference both in mind and body. Retreat was inevitable, so he thought, but he became suddenly very wide awake when he saw his guides turn sharply to the right and proceed without hesitation in a line parallel to the edge of the precipice. Their eyes were fixed intently on the ground as if they were looking for something. "This is the spot," said one. "Yes," replied his companion. On the face of the precipice was a small streak of clay, on which they found a footing, and cautiously descended. It was not an easy task, but to them, worn out as they were, any means of continuing the descent was preferable to a retreat. While they were traversing the glacier below, Tyndall asked the guides how they had found out the path. They replied that one day when they were examining the possible approaches to the summit, they saw a chamois trying to get up the precipice, and set themselves to watch. Time after time it failed, till it struck the slip of clay and made its way upwards with comparative ease. The value of such a discovery was too great to be lost, and the men made a mental note of the spot for future reference. Darkness came on, but it caused them no uneasiness, for they were now free from any uncertainty as to their path. They reached the camp in safety, and after packing up their belongings, waited until the moon rose. Then down again, on the last and least trying stage of their journey. Soon they saw the light of the hotel shining through the pine trees. The gleam cheered them, and they put on speed, for they were famished with hunger. Again they looked ahead, and all was dark. Evidently the landlord had given them up and gone to bed. One of the guides was accordingly sent on in front to arouse the house and order some food. About 11 o'clock Tyndall reached the hotel, and after supper went to bed, feeling as if he had drained the last ounce of strength out of his body. But after 6 hours' sleep he woke none the worse for his arduous adventure. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Whymper and the Matterhorn. The name of Edward Whymper is familiar to everyone as that of one of the most daring and successful of mountaineers. He has ventured life and limb over and over again to reach the summit of some mountain regarded by the natives themselves as inaccessible, and though often repulsed, he has returned to the attack till success at length rewarded his pluck and perseverance. Never under any circumstances has greater courage or bolder determination been displayed than by Whymper in his attempts to ascend the Matterhorn, that inaccessible obelisk of rock nearly 15,000 feet high, without a rival in the Alps, and with but few in the world. Daring his repeated ventures were, undoubtedly, foolhardy they certainly were not. It was in the year 1861 that his thoughts were first attracted to this mountain, the last great Alpine peak which remained unscaled. Several attempts had already been made to reach the summit by experienced climbers, among whom may be mentioned Professor Tyndall, but all had been driven back. Nor is their defeat to be wondered at when we know that the mountain rises abruptly by a series of cliffs which may properly be termed precipices, a clear 5,000 feet above the glaciers which surround its base. In addition to its natural difficulty, all manner of strange stories were told about it. How it was the abode of demons who dwelt among the ruins of a city which had once capped the summit, and travellers were gravely warned not to approach too near for fear of arousing the anger of the spirits. It was therefore almost impossible to get guides to make the ascent. The majority refused point blank to attempt it. The remainder put such a high price on their services as to make their willingness virtually a refusal. Having engaged a guide at Châtillon, Whymper made his way to Brael, where he tried to secure the services of Jean-Antoine Carrel, the most expert climber and guide at the place. This man alone of all the guides believed in the possibility of reaching the summit, and Whymper was therefore anxious to secure his co-operation, but the negotiations fell through, and the adventurer decided to start without him. On the 29th of August he and the Châtillon guide set out about 7 o'clock, and after an easy climb arrived at the ice. Their path then became broken up by numerous crevasses of considerable width, which increased in number and size the higher they ascended. They sought an easier route, and after some scrambling reached a point known as the Col du Lion. Here they decided to spend the night. The tent was fixed up, but as it did not offer a sufficiently firm surface to the wind, they had to take it down again for fear it should be swept over the cliffs, and they along with it. When night came on, they wrapped themselves in its folds and fell asleep, in spite of the intense cold which froze the water in a bottle under Whymper's head. In the middle of the night they were suddenly aroused by a tremendous noise overhead. The next instant a huge piece of rock came leaping down the mountain, fortunately at some distance from the camp, but near enough to send a shower of stones in alarming succession about their ears. At daybreak they set out again, making their way up the south-western ridge of the mountain. Every inch of the way had to be fought for. A long hard struggle brought them to the chimney, a smooth straight slab of rock, fixed at a considerable angle between two others equally smooth. The guide tried to climb this apparently insurmountable obstacle, but failed. Then Whymper made the attempt and succeeded. He lowered his rope to pull his companion up, but the man was too heavy. Whymper could not go on alone, and so the ascent had to be abandoned. The return was accordingly commenced, and Brayle was reached in safety. The failure of his first venture made Whymper more than ever determined to conquer the mountain. Accordingly, in the following year, he returned to Brayle, accompanied by a friend named MacDonald. On this occasion he brought with him a tent of special construction, which he hoped would be strong enough to resist the fierce winds which blew against the rock. On the 7th of July 1862 they started on their second attempt, accompanied by two guides and a little hunchback named Luc Maynet, who acted as porter. As they were ascending, one of the guides slipped and rolled down the mountain at a terrific rate. Fortunately his presence of mind did not desert him, and after a few frantic struggles he managed to stop. He had received no serious injury, but it was more than an hour before he recovered from the fright and severe shaking. When the march was resumed, their progress was slow, and darkness was coming on when the former encampment was reached. During the night a terrific hurricane broke over the mountain and continued with ever increasing force till long after sunrise. When it abated slightly, they ventured to leave their shelter to inquire into the state of the weather. But they had only gone a few hundred feet when a gust of wind swept down on them, and they were glad to drop on all fours and crouch as low as possible. In this position they remained for some minutes, afraid to move, till a lull in the gale enabled them to return to the tent. The guides then declined to go any further, and it was with feelings of deep disappointment that Whymper yielded to the stern necessity of returning, having accomplished nothing. When they arrived at Brayle, they found the guide Carrel waiting for them at the inn. He was evidently attracted by Whymper's dogged determination, and offered to accompany him on a fresh expedition, provided one of his friends was allowed to form one of the party. This was agreed to, and on the following day they set out. The weather was most favourable, and on this occasion they camped at a height of 13,000 feet. At 4 o'clock on the following morning they were off again, leaving their tent and provisions behind them. The "chimney" was passed in safety, but then misfortune appeared. One of the guides fell ill, and return was imperative. Bad weather made further attempts impossible for a week, and then, when the conditions seemed favourable, none of the guides would accompany him. His friend had meanwhile returned to England. Impatient of an indefinite delay, Whymper set out alone on the 18th of July to see if the tent which had been left behind was all right. He reached the spot and found everything as it had been left, and sat down to think over ways and means. He became so absorbed in his calculations that he did not notice the flight of time till it was too late for him to return. Fortunately there were some provisions in the tent, and he prepared to spend the night in this wild solitude. The next day dawned bright and beautiful, and he determined to go still higher if possible. Taking with him a good length of stout rope and a claw, an iron implement which would readily fasten itself in crevices of the rocks, he set out. The rope and claw rendered him yeoman service, and by their help he was enabled to ascend or descend dangerous passages in comparative safety. It was a terrible climb. At one moment he was hauling himself on to a narrow precipitous ridge by sheer force of muscle, in constant peril from loose and falling stones. At another he was pressed close to the face of a cliff, anxiously looking for some projection, however slight, to lay hold of, and not finding it, had to jump sideways onto a broader and safer footing. His quick eye, clear head, steady nerves, and sureness of foot rendered him equal to every call that was made on his energy and resource, and he succeeded in ascending, alone and unaided, to a height of nearly 15,000 feet above the sea, considerably higher than anyone had been before. He returned to the tent without adventure, and after a brief rest prepared to resume the descent. He had found his axe greatly in his way, and therefore decided to leave it behind, as he did not think he would require it on the way down. All went well till he reached the foot of the Col du Lion, where the path lay round an angle of the cliffs. Since his ascent the heat had melted the steps by which he had come up, and the snow was too hard to tread down. Bitterly did he regret the foolishness which caused him to part from his trusty axe. The only way out of the awkward predicament was to cut steps as best he could with the sharp point of his alpenstock. He managed to cut 2 steps, and was in the act of turning the corner to cut a third, when his foot unaccountably slipped. He fell on his back, and before he could recover himself he was carried down the steep slope with headlong speed. His stick was wrenched from his grasp as he was thrown violently against a rock. Head over heels he tumbled and went careering down by leaps and bounds, his body literally bouncing from rock to rock. He was conscious of striking his head several times in his wild flight, but he felt no pain. Suddenly there was a tremendous shock, and he was hurled 50 feet through the air and dashed against the rocks which rose on either side of the slope. He received the full force of the blow on his left side, but, wonderful to relate, his senses did not desert him. For a second his clothes caught in the rocks, and just as he was breaking away again, he managed to arrest his progress. The danger, however, was not yet over. 10 yards in front of him was a precipice, at the bottom of which, 800 feet below, lay a glacier. He was fearfully bruised and cut, especially about the head, and the blood spurted from his wounds at each heart-throb. His strength was fast leaving him, and he knew what his doom would be if he did not quickly get out of his awkward position. By an exercise of almost superhuman strength, he managed to crawl to a place of safety, and then went off in a dead faint. When he came to himself, the sun had nearly set, and when he reached the inn, it was pitch dark. He received every care and attention. As no bones were broken, he quickly recovered, and in a few days he was able to move about. On the 23rd he again ascended the mountain, accompanied by Carrel and another guide. This attempt was brought to an abrupt conclusion on the following day by a snowstorm. Whymper wished to wait in the camp until the weather cleared, but Carrel said that the snow would make the rocks slippery, and there was no choice left to them but to abandon the attempt. Whymper was very indignant at this useless waste of time and energy, and remonstrated with the man, but all to no purpose. On the way down, however, he promised to make another attempt on the following day, provided the weather was favourable. On the 25th, Whymper was waiting for his guides, when Mayne, the hunchback, came to the inn and said that Carrel could not accompany him as he had other work to do. Annoyed beyond measure at this peculiar conduct, which he was quite at a loss to explain, the mountaineer asked Mayne to accompany him. The little fellow gladly agreed. The road was now so familiar that they ascended rapidly, and in a few hours reached the tent. Here they spent the night, and on the following morning set out again very early. Mayne proved himself to be both ready and reliable, and Whymper had the satisfaction of passing the highest point he had reached on his solitary scramble. About 100 feet higher up, their farther progress was stopped by an almost perpendicular wall of rock, over which it was impossible to advance without ladders. They began the descent, highly satisfied with the performance. The ultimate conquest of the mountain was now only a question of time. When Whymper returned to the inn that evening, his high hopes were dashed to the ground. In his absence, Professor Tyndall had arrived and engaged Carrel and several other guides for the assault of the hitherto impregnable summit. The expedition was equipped with everything which experience could think of to facilitate the ascent, and their success seemed absolutely assured. It was with feelings the reverse of pleasant that Whymper watched the Professor's expedition set out. In imagination he already saw the summit won, and the triumph he had so long and painfully striven for snatched from his outstretched hand. His holiday had nearly expired, and he determined not to be a witness of his own defeat. But, on second thoughts, he decided to await the undoubted issue of the ascent. In due course the Professor returned, defeated. He had been, he said, within a stone's throw of the summit, when farther progress was found impossible, and declared that the mountain was inaccessible. Whymper returned to London, happy in the thought that the summit was still unconquered, but divided in his opinion whether or not it was possible to conquer it. In 1863 he returned again to the assault. He set out on the 10th of August before dawn, accompanied by Jean and Caesar Carrel, Luc Menet and 2 other men. The winter had wrought great changes in the appearance of the mountain. Where there had formerly been slabs of stone, there were now narrow, sharp peaks of ice, and the rocks in places were covered and rendered extremely difficult and dangerous by a thin coating of ice. As Carrel was about to cut away some snow, he suddenly slipped and would have been carried downward to certain destruction had he not been able to throw himself back onto the rock, and his comrades at once seized him. As he was being assisted to his feet, he quietly said, "High time we were tied up." They were roped together in pairs, and Carrel took the lead. This part of the ascent was the most adventurous Whymper had experienced on the Matterhorn. Their method of advance was slow but safe. The first 2 men ascended, helping each other as occasion demanded, those below paying out the rope as they advanced. When a slip took place, as it frequently did, he who lost his footing could not slide more than a few feet before he was drawn up by the others. As soon as the first couple reached a safe position, the next advanced, and so on. Thus the risk of accident was reduced to a minimum. All worked with a will, and the men did not seem to be conscious of the toil. Everything was in their favour, and Whymper looked forward confidently to sleeping within a few hundred feet of the summit. The cold suddenly increased, however, and almost before they were aware of it, a snowstorm came on, accompanied by a furious wind. Fortunately they were near a suitable place for camping, and they hurried to get under cover. Hardly had they erected their tent when a fearful thunderstorm burst over them. The thunder vibrated through the rocks, and the lightning lit up the surrounding peaks with weird and vivid flashes. They were in the very vortex of the tempest, and during the night the adventurers witnessed a sight of unparalleled grandeur and magnificence. The wind continued with unabated violence, and beat upon the tent in such a way that they were in momentary fear of being blown away bodily. To prevent such a catastrophe, 1 or 2 sallied out during a lull in the tempest and piled stones against the windward side of the tent. About 9 o'clock next day they started again, and it took them 2 hours to ascend about 300 feet. Snow then came on again, and it was decided to descend. They returned to the inn, worn out and disheartened, but determined to try again at a later date. It was not until the year 1865 that Whymper was once more before the stronghold he had so long endeavoured to capture. This time he decided to tempt fortune on the south-eastern side of the mountain. On the 21st of June he started, accompanied by 3 guides, Michael Croes, Christian Almer and Franz Biener. The faithful Luc Mayne accompanied the expedition as porter. At 10 o'clock they stopped for breakfast, and while it was preparing, Whymper went forward to examine the route. As he stood looking round, a few stones fell, but he paid no attention. Shortly afterwards a tremendous roar was heard and a great boulder tumbled down the mountain side. The men heard the noise and, looking up, saw a perfect shower of rocks coming down on them. They at once threw everything on one side and sought what shelter the place afforded. The masses crashed from crag to crag, striking fire in their passage. Many of them rebounded from the rocks opposite and landed on the ledge on which the men were, with deafening crash. After breakfast they started off again, and reached a height of a little over 11,000 feet, when bad weather and the difficulty of the way compelled them to retreat. Was the ascent possible? In the face of repeated rebuffs, it seemed as if the mountain was impregnable. But Whymper could not see why it should be so. Success, he argued, ought to come. But the question was, would it? End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Success and its cost. About a month after the events recorded in the previous chapter, Whymper was at Zermatt getting up a party to make another assault on the redoubtable Matterhorn. He had met a number of Englishmen, all of whom expressed an ardent desire to accompany him on the expedition. He gladly agreed, especially as they had each a reputation for skill and success in mountaineering adventures. The party was completed, the guides were chosen, and at 5:30 on the morning of the 13th of July 1865 they set out from Zermatt. They were 8 in number: Whymper, Lord Francis Douglas, Charles Hudson, Vicar of Skillington in Lincolnshire, Mr. Hadow, and the guides, Michael Croes, Peter Tangwalder and his 2 sons. They took with them a supply of provisions sufficient for 3 days. To guard against possibility of accident, each mountaineer was roped to a guide. The first day they ascended very slowly. The path they had chosen was comparatively easy, and in about 7 hours they reached a height of 11,000 feet. Here they encamped, and sent 2 of the guides forward to reconnoitre the path. In 2 hours they returned and reported most favourably of the route. The rest of the day was spent in preparing for the morrow, and shortly after sunset they had supper, and soon afterwards rolled themselves in their blankets. On the morning of the 14th they were up before dawn, and as soon as it was daylight they started, having first sent the youngest of the guides back to Zermatt. The way lay up a huge natural staircase for about 3,000 feet, no part of which presented any difficulty worthy of mention. At 10 o'clock they reached an altitude of 14,000 feet and paused for an hour. The summit was now well within their reach, and they congratulated themselves on a speedy and successful termination to their journey. When they started again, the ground became more difficult, and the utmost caution had to be observed in every movement. The most experienced of the party went first, as there was little to hold on by, and a slip in such a situation might have been serious. There was, however, nothing dangerous about the place, provided proper care was taken, and each one did exactly as he was told. With the exception of Haddell, who was only 19 years of age and unused to such laborious work, all the members of the expedition made the ascent without requiring any assistance, and in about an hour and a half the peril was over. Turning round an awkward corner of rock, the foremost men gave a shout of triumph, for there, across a sloping stretch of 200 feet of snow, lay the summit. 2 days before Whymper and his expedition had set out, another party led by Carrel had started from Brael, with the intention of reaching the summit. They were well equipped, and it seemed more than probable that they would reach the summit before the Englishmen, especially as they had so long a start. Over and over again on the way up, Whymper had turned his anxious eyes to the top, fully expecting to see his rivals triumphant. As he approached the end of his toils and ambition, his excitement was intense, and the moment the last man reached the slope, he unfastened the rope which bound him to his companions and ran up as fast as his legs could carry him. Crows, fired by his enthusiasm, followed his example. After a close race they reached the summit together, and to their unbounded delight found that theirs was the victory. Not a footprint marked the snow. They hurrahed until they were nearly hoarse, and for a few minutes completely abandoned themselves to the intoxication of triumph. When that had passed, they looked on all sides for their rivals. "There they are on that ridge about 12,000 feet below. We must give those fellows a shout to let them know they are beaten." They raised their voices and hallooed in chorus till they were tired, without seeming to have made Carrel's party hear. So that there should be no mistake, Whymper and Crows began to hurl down rocks and stones. This had the desired effect. Carrel's men were seen to look up, and in the next moment they turned and fled, thinking, perhaps, that there was some truth in the old stories about the top of the mountain being inhabited by demons. Fixing the tent pole in the highest point, Crows took off his blouse and fastened it to serve as a flag, that those below might know of the success of the expedition. They then raised a cairn of stones to record the fact to any who might follow that they were not the first who had scaled the summit. In this cairn was placed a bottle containing a slip of paper, on which was written the names of those who had formed the successful party. We then paid homage to the view. The atmosphere was perfectly still and free from all clouds and vapours. Mountains 50, nay 100 miles off looked sharp and clear. All their details, ridge and crag, snow and glacier, stood out with faultless definition. All were revealed, not one of the principal peaks of the Alps was hidden. After spending an hour on the summit, they prepared to descend. Securely tied together with strong ropes, they marched down the slope. Crows first, Haddell second, Hudson, Douglas, Tangwalder, his son, and Whymper last. All went well till they reached the point at which such care had been necessary in the ascent. Again the utmost caution was observed. Only one man descended at a time, and his companion remained stationary until he had obtained a secure foothold. As is frequently the custom with mountaineers, Michael Crows, after having cut a step, laid aside his axe and took hold of Haddell by the legs to put his feet into the proper positions. As he turned away, Haddell suddenly slipped and fell against the guide. Taken by surprise, he was knocked over and slid down the slope, followed by the unfortunate cause of the accident. Next moment Hudson was dragged off his feet and pulled Lord Douglas after him. When the others saw what had happened, they planted themselves firmly against the rocks to withstand the shock which would come when the rope tightened. There was a sudden jerk, and they stood unmoved. Their companions would soon be on their feet again, but, alas! the rope which connected Tangwalder and Douglas snapped under the strain. The terrible tragedy was over in a few seconds. Down they slid on their backs, wildly stretching out their hands in a vain endeavour to save themselves. One by one they dropped out of sight and fell from ledge to ledge down to the glacier 4,000 feet below. For over half an hour the survivors stood rooted to the spot with horror. The two guides were completely unmanned. They trembled and wept like children, wailing piteously, "We are lost! We are lost!" Their grief was pitiful. Whymper's position was perilous in the extreme, and he expected any moment that he might share the fate of his comrades. After a time he succeeded in rousing the elder man to a sense of duty, but before they began the descent he asked for the rope which had broken. It was handed to him. To his dismay he saw that it was old and, in comparison with the others, thin and altogether unsuitable for the purpose to which it had been put. It had been brought as a reserve, and was only intended to be used should the supply of the better rope be used up. The discovery was a most appalling one, but the fact had to be faced. In silence the descent was begun. Whymper had had many adventures on the Matterhorn and others of the Alps, but never was he so near death as on this occasion. The guides shook and faltered, and more than once, overcome by the peril of the path, the older man stood stock still, unable to move another step. At the end of 2 hours the danger was past, and the descent was continued with greater speed. Suddenly a fearful and wondrous sight met their gaze as they looked upward. In the sky was seen a mighty bow, colourless, as if formed of mist. The guides felt sure that it had some mysterious significance, a supernatural sign which had some reference to the late disaster. This suspicion was confirmed in their minds when two enormous crosses were seen becoming gradually more distinct within the arch. The strange phenomenon remained motionless among the clouds for some time, and then disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as it had come. Darkness fell soon afterwards, and they halted for the night. Sleep was out of the question after the shock and the awful strain on the nerves, and dawn was gladly welcomed by the little party after the seemingly interminable hours of night. A start was at once made, and in a short time Zermatt was reached. With a heart bursting with grief, Whymper went to the inn and told the mournful news. "The Tangwolders and I have returned," he said. That was all. No more was needed. At once the landlord aroused the village, and a party of men set out to look for traces of the lost mountaineers. In 6 hours they returned and reported that they had seen the bodies but were unable to reach them. On the following day Whymper led another search party. After a climb of nearly 7 hours' duration, they reached a spot at the top of the glacier. "As we saw," says Whymper, "one weather-beaten man after another raise the telescope, turn deadly pale, and pass it on without a word to the next. We knew that all hope was gone." They went to the spot and found the bodies in the same order as they had disappeared over the precipice, except that of Lord Francis Douglas, of whom no trace could be seen. "We left them where they fell, buried in snow at the base of the grandest cliff of the most majestic mountain of the Alps." A few days later a strong party of guides was sent out by the authorities to recover the bodies for burial. They accomplished their task successfully, and Crows, Hadow and Hudson were interred in the Zermatt churchyard. A few scraps of clothing belonging to Lord Douglas were also picked up, but his body was never recovered. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Caught in an avalanche. It was a beautiful moonlight night in February 1864 when Philip Gossett, accompanied by a friend and 4 guides, set out from the village of Arton to attempt the ascent of the Hors de Crie. All the men were experienced mountaineers, ready, brave and self-reliant. For some distance the path was very steep, but the party made fairly good progress till they reached a dense pine forest which clothed the lower sides of the mountains. Then the snow became soft and they sank into it at every step. Travelling was slow and laborious, but still they kept pushing on, resolved, however, if the path did not improve higher up, that they would give up the ascent. As they advanced, the surface gradually improved, and at a height of a little over 7,000 feet, the snow was sufficiently hard to enable them to advance at a fairly good pace. They were in excellent spirits, for the mountain summit with its crystal glitter was above them at only a short distance, as it seemed. But their good fortune soon deserted them. Every now and then they sank into the snow, which was frozen only on the surface, and it was with the utmost difficulty and toil that they continued the advance. How slow their progress was may be judged from the fact that it took them nearly 3 hours to ascend 1,000 feet. Later on they again struck a hard path, and their hopes of success were renewed. Suddenly, however, the two leading guides sank up to their waists. As it was impossible for them to extricate themselves, they forced their bodies through the snow, thus making a deep furrow. They were at once ordered to halt, for fear of starting an avalanche. Gossett proposed that they should retrace their steps and seek some other and safer path. The others would not hear of such a thing, and the march was resumed. Presently a firm footing was again obtained, but the adventurers had only advanced a few steps when they were brought to a dead standstill by a sound which thrilled them with terror. They stood for a moment as if rooted to the spot, and the voice of the chief guide was heard saying in hollow tones, "We are all dead men." About 15 feet above them they saw an ominous crack in the snow, and in silence, deep as death, they waited for what would happen. Then the ground on which they stood began to move down the mountain side. They were caught in an avalanche. Then followed an adventure such has been the fate of few men to experience and live to record. Gossett was carried downwards on his back for some distance, but managed to turn round and face the valley. Down thundered the avalanche with ever increasing speed. The wave of snow rose and overwhelmed him. It fell again and set him free to breathe and look around. Oh, the horror of it! The head of the avalanche was enveloped in a fine snow mist, while all around the mass writhed and hissed like thousands of angry serpents. Slowly, however, the snow tempest subsided. Its movement became less and less rapid. Mysteriously as it had started, it stopped. First the head, and so gradually backwards. Gossett, who had managed to keep himself on the surface, was brought suddenly to a standstill. The snow behind him was still sliding forward, completely burying him, and by its tremendous pressure nearly crushing the life out of him. Then everything became still, and he attempted to clear away the snow which covered him, but he was absolutely powerless. He was frozen in the avalanche, which was now pressed together into one solid mass. Again he tried to free himself, and to his inexpressible joy he found that he was able to use his hands. Quickly he scraped away the snow overhead and obtained a little more breathing space, but his arms were too firmly wedged to allow of him piercing the surface. His strength was spent, and he gave himself up for lost, when it occurred to him that he might dissolve the thin crust which imprisoned him by his breath. The plan was successful. There came a sudden flow of air, and through the tiny opening he had made he caught a glimpse of the blue sky. He strained his ears to catch the slightest noise, but not a sound reached him in his ice prison. Quickly the thoughts followed one another through his brain. All his comrades must be dead, he reflected mournfully, and with that strange unnatural calmness which comes in situations which leave no niche for hope, he wondered how long it would be ere he joined them. Hark! What was that? A shout? Yes, the voice of one of the guides. Gossett shouted, and the man approached with cautious steps. Again he shouted, and the next minute the guide was removing the snow from about his head. The first object that attracted the attention of the half extricated climber was a boot, which he at once identified as belonging to the friend who had accompanied him on his ill-fated expedition. It was within his reach, and he shook it, but no movement was made in return. His friend was evidently unconscious. What if he was dead? In a few minutes the 3 surviving guides came up and reported that they could find no sign of the fourth, the one who had said, "We are all dead men." They at once set to work to cut Gossett out with their axes. It was a laborious job, for the ice had to be cut from around him down to his feet before he could be set at liberty. They then turned their attention to the other man, but it soon became evident that he was dead, crushed and suffocated under an overwhelming mass of snow. As soon as this was known, the guides refused to do any more, in spite of Gossett's earnest pleadings with them to lift up the body of his friend. The poor fellows were unequal to the task. The intense cold and the fearful experience they had undergone had completely unnerved them. Gossett himself was almost useless, and it was agreed to return at once. The descent was accordingly begun, and after a weary journey of nearly 6 hours, the melancholy survivors reached Arton in safety. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Falling rocks and sliding snows. One of the most noticeable features of mountain scenery, which attracts the attention of the visitor to Chamonix, is the Aiguille du Midi. Standing at the point where the Glacier de Bosson falls into the valley, it rises into a succession of tiers thousands of feet above, till at length the narrow snow-topped ridge is reached, which forms the edge of the vast plateau stretching away on the other side. From its position and appearance, the peak has been spoken of as "Nature's lighthouse," erected to guide travellers over the snowy plains of Mont Blanc. About 2 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of July 1869, G. E. Foster and Horace Walker, accompanied by 2 guides, Jacob Anderegg and Hans Baumann, set out from Chamonix to make the ascent of the Aiguille. The moon shone out brightly as they made their way over the wave-like formations of ice from which their mer de glace takes its name. Rain had fallen on the previous night, and having frozen as it fell, rendered walking difficult and laborious. The advance entailed ever-increasing exertions. Steps had to be cut in the ice slopes, numerous crevasses had to be jumped, and narrow slippery ice-coated ridges traversed, which called forth all the nerve and skill of the climbers. At length more favourable ground was reached, but what was gained in surface was lost in the bewildering maziness of the route. It was quite impossible either to see the direction of the path or to follow it with any prospect of success. A change of direction was therefore decided on, and at 6 o'clock the party sat down to breakfast. After half an hour's rest they set off again, making for a smooth slope which seemed likely to be easy of ascent. For a time all went well, but soon they were brought to a halt. In front of them lay a glacier broken by huge parallel crevasses, with an utterly impracticable icefall beyond. After a brief consultation, they decided that the peak must lie at the other side of the opposite snowfield, and resolved to attempt the passage of the glacier. For a time they toiled among the crevasses, crossing them whenever a bridge could be found, till they saw that they could not reach the peak by this route. A turn to the left was accordingly made, but again disappointment went before them. Another glacier, which sunk to a depth of 50 feet, presented a wall which it was absolutely hopeless to attempt to descend. A similar obstruction lay on their right. What was to be done? In this emergency Jacob proposed that he should go on alone and endeavour to find a path, or make one. And as none of the others had any better suggestion to offer, he set off. His companions waited for some time, and as he did not return, they went after him. Following in Jacob's footsteps, they reached a long narrow ridge, bounded on the right by a crevasse 30 feet wide, and so deep that the bottom was obscured by a bluish mist, while on the left was a wall which went straight down to a glacier below. Making their way along the ridge, they overtook Jacob at a point where a bend in the crevasse brought the sides within 2 feet of each other, but with the top of the upper one 30 feet overhead. The mountaineer's motto may well be, "Never say fail." The only way to reach the opposite height was by cutting steps up the steep face of the cliff, and Jacob at once set himself to this task. With a few swinging blows of his axe, he cut footholds as high up as he could reach, then gripping his axe close to the head, he prepared to ascend. To the entreaties of his companions that he should put a rope round him, he turned a deaf ear. A laborious and dangerous climb took him to the top in safety. Then the others, roped together, followed, making use of the steps he had formed. They found that they had all their work to do to keep from falling backwards, and to them it seemed little less than a miracle that the guide had been able to keep his balance. At length the party reached a slope, the easy and gradual ascent of which was a pleasant change from the trying difficulties of the morning. The long wished for upper snowfields were still out of their reach, and they turned to the left where the crevasses seemed easy to cross, as they were partly bridged by avalanches. Here, however, the condition of the snow made the advance slow and laborious. Owing to its softness, Bowman sank several times up to his waist. On each occasion it was necessary to pull him back before another attempt could be made. Still they persevered in the face of new and ever recurring difficulties, and after 8 hours of almost incessant toil they reached the snowfield. It was of wide extent, and the crossing of it occupied nearly an hour. At the end of that time the goal of their struggles was practically won. A halt of half an hour and a second breakfast supplied them with the energy necessary for the serious work of the last ascent. At the point where they were, the rock formed an unbroken slab which it was impossible to climb, so they turned to the left in search of a practicable path. A gap in the rocks suggested a possible route, of which the adventurers were not slow to avail themselves. But before they could reach it, they had to descend several hundred feet. This was accomplished in safety, and the last 700 feet of the mountain was assailed. The ascent was most difficult, having to be made over large slabs of stone which taxed their muscles to the utmost. Their progress was slow but sure, and at 12 o'clock the summit was gained. Here an hour of intense enjoyment was spent, and then the descent was begun. Difficult as the ascent had been, it was far less trying than the downward path. It required both strength, quickness and skill to lower oneself over the long and rotten slabs of stone down to a footing which was somewhere below, but its exact whereabouts could not be seen. Wishing to reach the Glacier des Bossons, the party kept to the right and arrived safely at the foot of the lighthouse. While they were descending the rocky precipice overlooking the glacier, the adventurers had a narrow escape from a fatal termination to their expedition. At the time of the accident, Jacob was leading, and was followed by Walker and Foster, Bowman bringing up the rear. Every precaution necessary on such an occasion was carefully observed. The party was roped together, only one man moved at a time, and the rope was kept tight between each man. Suddenly, as Jacob was crossing a narrow gully, about 40 feet of the wall above him broke loose, and, with a terrifying crash, hundreds of tons of rocks rolled down towards him, sweeping him from his hold and hurling him over the precipice. Fortunately, Walker was able to bear up against the sudden shock, and to hold on in spite of the fearful strain. For some minutes nothing was heard but the awful report of the rocky avalanche. Then a silence, deep as death, succeeded. In dismay, the men looked at one another the question, "What has become of Jacob?" The rope was tightly drawn over the edge of the precipice, which showed that the guide was at the end of it. But whether he was living or dead, it was impossible to tell. "Jacob! Jacob!" they called, but no answer came back. Again they called, and this time a faint reply was heard that brought relief unspeakable, and nerved them for what might follow. Craning over the rock, Walker caught a glimpse of the guide, who seemed to be badly hurt and bleeding profusely. Then Foster cautiously shifted his position so that he could see more clearly, and beheld a sight which, under the circumstances, was enough to make the stoutest turn away in horror. The guide's face was black and bleeding, the skin was torn from his hands, and his clothes were in shreds, a circumstance which pointed to still more terrible injuries to be yet discovered. With astounding fortitude, Jacob contrived to regain his footing, and with trembling fingers untied the rope. Crawling along the face of the cliff to the other side of the gully, he reached a small patch of snow and began to staunch the bleeding of his numerous wounds. With extreme caution, the remainder of the party made their way over the treacherous spot and joined their injured companion. He had indeed had a wonderful escape. He was bruised all over, but no bones were broken. This he accounted for by the fact that none of the rocks had struck him with full force. The wound on his face, which was about the worst, was caused by a huge stone that grazed his cheek, and would certainly have knocked out his brains if he had not retained sufficient presence of mind to pull his head back. Gradually the bleeding lessened, and in less than half an hour the hardy fellow was ready to take his place again. When they came to tie themselves together, the full providence of Jacob's escape became apparent. All the strands of the rope by which he had been suspended were cut, except one. Leaving the rocks, they continued the descent for some distance on a snow slope. Bowman led the way, and Walker, whose ribs were hurt by the strain of supporting Jacob, brought up the rear. A narrow gully with deep snow promised a better footing, and thither they shaped their course. There was in this place a danger of avalanche, but as the going was easier they decided to keep on. Suddenly Walker gave a shout. When the others turned round, they saw an avalanche descending, and the next instant it was upon them. Walker and Jacob managed to get on to the sides of the gully, and Foster quickly followed their example. Bowman was less fortunate. The snow swept over him, and he was nearly buried, but he managed to escape without having sustained any injury. After this they left the gully and made their perilous way down on the ice, which was covered by a thin layer of snow. Soon, however, they had to return again, for a crevasse barred their farther progress, and the only means of getting to the other side was by crossing the snows, which repeated avalanches had poured down the gully till they had filled up the crevasse, thus forming a bridge. Bowman was cutting his way down when a terrific crash resounded above. Looking up, the climbers saw another avalanche of rocks descending from a height of about 2,000 feet. Not a moment was there to throw away. The death-dealing artillery of the mountain would be on them in a moment. Rapidly the guide cut the steps. Man followed man promptly. 6 steps were cut, and then the bridge was reached. They rushed across and down the debris on the other side. Just then a prodigious avalanche of snow and rocks was hurled over the spot where they had been standing only a minute before. But they had experienced worse things, and with the laconic remark, "That was a narrow squeak," they resumed the march. The rest of the descent was accomplished without adventure, and the party reached their hotel at 8 o'clock, weary and hungry, but well pleased with their exciting day. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Alpine Hero. It used to be a favourite saying that "the age of chivalry is dead," but the press records so often illustrations to the contrary that we need not take the cry too seriously. Here, for example, is an instance of what men are still ready to dare and do in the spirit of self-forgetfulness. Late in the afternoon of the 14th of November 1881, 4 guides were making their way towards the Burghley hut on the Monk's Jock. The hut was old and had fallen into a state of disrepair, and the men were on their way to examine it and see what could be done to make it fit for next season's service. Night was rapidly coming on, and there seemed little prospect of them reaching their destination before darkness set in, yet their pace was slow, and when it was suggested by one of the party that they should quicken their steps, a motion of silence and a warning look towards a comrade toiling painfully in the rear told as plainly as words that greater speed was impossible. "What is the matter with you, Peter?" asked one. "Had we better not rest a while?" suggested another. "No, no," replied Peter Schlegel stoutly. "Let us hurry forward while daylight lasts, for many dangerous crevasses lie in the path. I shall be better presently." A little way farther on, however, Schlegel dropped on the snow with a smothered groan, exclaiming, "I am done up. You must go on without me." To this his companions would not agree, and they expressed their determination to stay with him all night if necessary. Schlegel vehemently protested, and pointed out to them the folly and danger of such a course. With heroic self-denial he urged them to push on and leave him where he was. "By the time you reach the hut I shall likely be all right again. Then after you have had something to eat, one of you can come down and help me up." The others did not like the idea of leaving the sick man in such a position, but a little consideration showed them that the course he proposed was the best. They accordingly made him as comfortable as possible and hurried forward. One obstacle after another rose in their path and hindered their progress. On 2 occasions gigantic crevasses barred the way, and it was only after a long and tiresome search that in each case a frail ice bridge was found, over which they managed to skim across. When they reached the hut darkness had set in, and they were completely worn out. After supper one of the men said, "Give me the lantern and I'll go down and bring Peter up." Then the startling discovery was made that the precious lantern had been left behind with Schlegel. The question, what was to be done, now became momentous. It was a task of more than ordinary difficulty, even for those hardy guides, to descend by that perilous way, and to attempt it without a light would have been madness. Each one looked to his companion to fulfil the promise that had been made to the sick man. "It's a comfort," said one, "that he is warmly wrapped up." "Oh, he'll be all right," remarked another. "He will have found the lantern by this time and know that we cannot come." Peter Egger, however, could not rest. He left his companions, and going a little way down the mountain, he called his friend by name at the top of his voice. A faint echo was the only answer. Again he called, but with no other result. "Perhaps he has fallen asleep," he muttered as he made his way back to the hut. A few minutes later, as the men were talking, a faint "Hello!" reached their ears like a voice from another world. "That's Schlegel calling," shouted Egger, as he rushed out of the hut and called back in answer. "He'll be calling to let us know he is all right and has found the lantern and doesn't expect us down," said one. "Be that as it may," answered Egger, who entered the hut. "I don't like the idea of leaving him alone all night on the mountain side, especially as we promised to return for him." "What can we do, man?" exclaimed one of his companions. "We've no lantern, and to attempt the descent without it is impossible. You would walk into the first crevasse before you knew where you were." Egger could not but admit the truth of the remark, but he was restless and impatient, and seemed to be turning over some plan in his mind. "I think I'll make a try for it," he muttered as he went to the door of the hut. In a few minutes he returned, with his plan of action clearly drawn out. "I think I can find my way down to Schlegel," he said. "It's a still night, and our candle stuck in the neck of a bottle will give me sufficient light." No sooner said than done. He broke the neck of a bottle, stuck the candle into it, and with this feeble light set out on his errand of mercy. One of his companions accompanied him. The first crevasse was reached, and with little difficulty the bridge was found. The place had looked forbidding enough under ordinary circumstances, but now the feeble glimmer of the candle rendered it absolutely appalling. A narrow bridge of thin ice spanned a gulf of unfathomable blackness. Again Egger called Schlegel by name, and an answering hallo was heard in reply. Quickly fastening the rope round his waist, he gave the other end to his companion, saying, "Hang on to that, for if the ice gives way, it is my only chance of life. When I get to the other side I will untie myself. You must plant your axe firmly in the ice and fasten your end of the rope to it, but don't pull the line in. I shall need it when I bring Schlegel up. Good night." In another moment he had crossed the crevasse in safety, and was hurrying down the mountain. His companion watched his descent by the flickering flame of the candle until it grew dim and passed from sight. He then carried out the instructions he had received, and returned to the hut. Egger made his way swiftly down the mountain, stopping every now and then to shout "Schlegel! Peter Schlegel!" as much to cheer his comrade as to direct his steps by the answering cry. The second crevasse was crossed without difficulty, and soon the guide was gladdened by the sight of Schlegel sitting among the snow. "How are you now?" was his first question. "I'm all right. I'm glad to see you, though. I thought you were never coming." "Well, you see, we left the lantern with you, and it was no easy work to venture down with only the light of a candle. It's an ugly road. Never mind, I'm here all right, so pack up and let us make a start for the hut. Where's the lantern?" It was quickly found, and while Schlegel busied himself in getting ready, Egger prepared to light the lamp. Suddenly he gave a shout and dropped the candle in the snow. "What's happened?" asked Schlegel, in surprise at finding himself in darkness. "Cut my hand badly. Strike a match." The light showed Egger's hand crimson with blood which gushed from an ugly wound in his right hand. That it was a serious hurt was evident, but little did either man think that the radial artery had been severed by the ragged edge of the bottle neck, and that death was only a question of hours. Schlegel bound up the wound with his handkerchief, and as he did so a jet of blood spurted into his face. With trembling hands he began to bind up the cut anew, while perspiration stood on his forehead in great beads. This was more serious than it appeared. The bleeding still continued. He unbound the wound and tied it up again. He applied snow. He grasped his comrade's wrist like a vice in the hope of stopping the bleeding, but all was in vain. Everything that he could think of in his terror he tried, but without producing any effect. Meanwhile the two men away up in the hut thought it was about time their companions were returning, and went to the door to see if their light was in sight. Just then they heard a cry for help, and hurried to the edge of the crevasse. "What's the matter?" they shouted. An agonising cry for "Help! Help!" was the only answer. "What do you want?" they called. Schlegel replied, and after a time managed to make them understand what had happened. But they were helpless, even more so than Schlegel himself. They could not attempt the descent without a light, and they returned to the hut to wait till the moon rose. Egger was now so weak from loss of blood that he could not stand, so Schlegel dug a hole in the snow and laid him gently in it. He was sinking fast. The white snow where he lay was crimson, but never a murmur of complaint passed his lips. Occasionally he groaned. Perhaps he was thinking of the wife and children who were expecting his homecoming on the morrow, and wondering how they would fare when the breadwinner was no more. The moon rose, and soon afterwards the other two guides arrived. They brought with them some hot cocoa which they had prepared. The wounded man with difficulty swallowed a few mouthfuls, and sank back exhausted. The hole was dug deeper, and when Egger was seen to shiver, his comrades, by a common impulse, stripped off their flannel shirts and wrapped him in them. Then they rushed down in the direction of Grindelwald to summon help. Gradually Egger sank into a state of insensibility, while Schlegel watched over him and tried to ease him. But the greatness of the poor fellow's need mocked his friend's feeble efforts. We can well imagine the torturing thoughts that filled Schlegel's mind during those weary hours, and nearly drove him distracted. Self-reproach at the reason of the accident, agony at his helplessness, an infinite pity and admiration for the man who had not flinched from his duty, and had braved the dangers of such a descent rather than break a promise. How easy would it have been for him to have made the excuse that there was not a light, or to have waited till the moon rose. When day dawned, Egger was at the last gasp, and a few minutes later all was over. Schlegel covered up the body and hurried down the valley with the sad news that help was now of no avail. On the following day a number of the dead man's friends ascended the mountain, and brought down all that was mortal of him who had indeed lost his life in the effort to save his friend. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A fearful fall. In the long list of Alpine accidents, there is none more melancholy and regrettable than that which took place on the Mage in 1885. On the 5th of August in that year, two brothers, Emil and Otto Sigmundi, accompanied by Dr. Schultz, set out from La Barade. Their intention was to climb the western peak of the Mage by a new way. All three men were experienced climbers and considered themselves equal to any emergency which might arise. In the previous month the ascent of the mountain had been made, and the brothers had taken part in the successful adventure, so they set off without guides. The first night was spent at a hut a few miles from La Barade, and at 2 o'clock on the following morning they started again by the light of lanterns. At first the path lay through slopes of moraine, accumulations of stones and other debris, such as are commonly found at the foot of glaciers, and their progress was slow. Then they crossed the Glacier des Étançons, which was broken up by many crevasses and deep holes, and about 6 o'clock they gained the rocks. Here they were exposed to repeated falls of stones. The weather looked threatening, and presently a storm began to rage, from the fury of which they were forced to shelter themselves. When the sky cleared they resumed the ascent, making their way along a rocky ledge. At every step the difficulties increased. The greater part of the ledge was covered with snow, which had only recently fallen, but which fortunately did not extend to the edge of the precipice. It was along the narrow space thus left that the adventurers made their way. It soon became evident that a higher ascent was impossible, and Otto and the doctor agreed that it would be wisest to abandon the undertaking. Emil, on the other hand, had argued from the first that his route was not only practicable but easier and less perilous than the usual way. It was therefore only natural that he should be unwilling to abandon the adventure until every resource had been exhausted. While his companions rested, he fastened a length of stout manila rope round his waist, and started to scramble up the steep face of the cliff and right overhead. With astonishing pluck he persevered, and each succeeding rebuff seemed only to endow him with greater resource and determination. Right and left he went, but without success. He then turned his attention to a steep gully which ascended straight upwards from where his companions were waiting. The route presented no very great difficulties, and he got about half-way up when he called out, "It doesn't go any farther." His comrades told him to come back, and he began to descend. A fall of stones, dislodged by the climber, caused Otto and the doctor to seek shelter under a projecting rock, where they remained for a while in momentary expectation of Emil's return. As he did not come, they looked out again, and saw to their surprise that he was continuing the ascent. He had already passed the place which a few moments before he had found impassable, and he was gaining ground slowly but surely, step by step, on the mountain. So he went on till he ascended so far that the rope was all used. cannot go any farther for want of rope," he shouted down. "Have you a small coil with you?" His brother answered that there was a length of silk rope, which he would tie on if it would be of any use. A cheery "All right, thank you," was the answer, so the silk rope was fastened to the manilla, and the intrepid climber continued the ascent in spite of his friend's entreaties that he should come down. The sight that met the gaze of the watchers as they looked up was one well calculated to cause a shudder of dismay. The rock was perfectly perpendicular, if indeed it did not slightly overhang, and towards this fearsome place Emile was working his way. To give him greater security, he made a loop in the rope and fastened it onto a projecting rock overhead. Then, holding on with both hands, he lowered himself a few feet. "I wish he would come down," remarked Otto. "I am afraid an accident may happen." The words were scarcely spoken, when suddenly — how it happened is impossible to tell — perhaps the loop slipped off the projection. Emile fell and was thrown with great force on the ledge under which his companions were standing. With marvellous presence of mind and promptitude, Otto seized the rope, wound it round his arm, and threw the loose part over a rocky spike near. The doctor laid hold of the end and braced himself for the shock. That instant the body of the unfortunate man bounded over their heads. The rope was torn off the spike, and the whole weight came on the two men. The suddenness and force of the strain pulled Otto to the ground, and before he could catch hold of anything, he was carried downwards and over the edge of the precipice. In a second he would have dragged the doctor after him, but he grasped a rocky tooth with both arms and clung to it with the grip of despair. At the same moment the rope snapped. Without a cry, Emile was swiftly carried downwards across a snowfield, and then passed out of sight over a precipice 2,000 feet deep down to the Glacier des Atansons. All was over in a few seconds. When Otto was extricated from his perilous position, he was in a fearful condition. His left thumb was broken, his face was streaming with blood, his right hand was severely injured, and his arm was terribly bruised by the rope. Nor had the doctor escaped scatheless. His right hand was badly cut and his body bruised. It is impossible to imagine a more awful situation. Words cannot picture the horror of that descent. Grief, nervousness, fatigue combined to make the already difficult path almost impossible, and it took them nearly 5 hours to reach the glacier, where they found the mangled body. On again they went. Darkness came on, and it was with the greatest difficulty that they reached the hut. Next morning a party was organised, which brought the body down to La Barade, where it was buried. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A perilous climb. On the 23rd of September 1887, a party set out from the hotel at Murren in the Bernese Oberland. to attempt the ascent of the Silberhorn by a route which had never before been successful. Henry Seymour King, the well-known mountaineer, was the leader. He was accompanied by a porter and 2 guides, Ambrose Supersax and Louis Zerbrucken. They made their way without difficulty to the spot where they had arranged to spend the night, and after a good night's rest they were early astir and impatient to resume the ascent. The season was far advanced, and it was not till 5 o'clock that there was sufficient daylight to enable them to start. King and the 2 guides set out, leaving their provisions and other things in charge of the porter. They only took with them a knapsack of necessaries, and as they did not know if they would return that way, they instructed the porter to watch for their appearance higher up the mountain. If they made a signal to him, he was to wait their return, but if no sign was given, he must pack up the things and return. Making for the gap at the extreme westerly end of the ridge which ran down the rock face, they advanced rapidly till they were just below the gap. Here, owing to the excessive smoothness of the rock and the consequent difficulty of finding foothold, they experienced some delay, but they finally reached the gap. They now congratulated themselves that the worst part of their climb was over, and that the question of reaching the summit was only a matter of time. Their rejoicings were, however, premature, as they discovered to their cost almost the next moment. From the gap they attempted to reach the ridge, which was not more than 20 feet above them. On all sides the rocks overhung in such a way that it was impossible to surmount them. Each man tried in turn, but all 3 had to return unsuccessful and exhausted. An hour was spent in vain endeavours, then they sat down to breakfast and to discuss further operations. As he was looking round, King spied a bottle in a niche of the rock. To scramble up, seize hold of it and open it was the work of a minute. On the paper inside were found the names of 2 mountaineers and the guides, and an account of their journey up the mountain to this point, which had taken place many years before. This was adding insult to injury. To think that they had almost worn themselves out, and yet had only reached a point which had already been won by previous adventurers. It was not to be borne. The news added fuel to the fire of their determination, and they resolved to reach the summit, cost what it might. A moment's calm reflection, however, showed them that it was impossible. No human being could climb an angle such as that which the rocks made. Ambrose alone persisted in his resolve, declaring, "There was no power in the tongue of man to alter him." When the others spoke of returning, he told them that they might please themselves. As for him, he meant to overcome the difficulty, and would not go one step backward until he had. Tying the rope firmly round his waist, he ordered his comrades to lower him down the northern side of the mountain. With all the skill of the expert cragsman, he worked his way down and along till 100 feet of rope were expended. A second length of 8 feet was added, and this also was paid out. But the way to the ridge had not been found. "He will have to return now," said the men to each other. Just then Ambrose's voice was heard in tones of command, telling them to "let go the rope." Warning and entreaty were alike thrown away on the determined guide. He repeated his orders, and began to pull in the rope, which he coiled up, slung over his shoulder, and then resumed his perilous climb unaided. Half an hour passed, and the two watchers began to feel anxious. They shouted, but no answer was returned. Some accident had surely befallen him. Shortly afterwards they were started from their melancholy musings by a cheery shout overhead. Ambrose had succeeded in his wild adventure and had surmounted the ridge. Almost before they could realise the fact, they saw his face peering over the cliff above them. It was really a magnificent exhibition both of pluck and skill. Lowering the rope, Ambrose hauled his companions one by one onto the top of the ridge. Some idea of the impracticable nature of the place may be formed from the fact that when King was hauled up he was utterly breathless, from the exertions he had had to make and from the pressure of the rope on his ribs. For a time he could only lie on his back and gasp feebly. 2 hours had been spent in endeavouring to reach the ridge, and the adventurers now pressed forward rapidly to make up for lost time. Presently, however, the ridge became so narrow that they could only proceed by crawling on hands and knees, and farther on they had to drag themselves along sitting astride the narrow rock. When at length it became wide enough to permit them to stand, the surface was so bad that they had to take to the ice for some distance. After an arduous climb they reached the summit of the peak at the eastern end, from which they had a view of the Silberhorn, jutting out like a great white promontory into a frozen sea. The day was now so far advanced that they saw it would be impossible to return by the way they had come. Looking back, they saw the porter in the distance waiting for the signal, but they made no sign, so he packed up and went home. Continuing their ascent, the travellers found the snow in such a dangerous condition that they once more returned to the rocks for fear of starting an avalanche. This was one of the most trying portions of the ascent, for the rocks were in a crumbling state, and there was ice about in considerable quantities. A climb of 2 hours and a half brought them to the summit at 3:30, and they advanced nearly to the end of the promontory. But the lateness of the hour compelled them to think of the return. In less than 3 hours darkness would be upon them, and it was a question whether it would not be better to spend the night on the mountain, or to push on and try to reach one of the huts on the neighbouring Jungfrau. The latter course was decided on, though the success of it depended on two circumstances over which they had no control: the condition of the slopes leading up to the snowfield which encircles the Jungfrau, and whether there were any recently made steps by which they might descend the mountain. At all events, they thought anything was preferable to spending the night exposed to the biting north wind which swept the heights. They were not long in doubt as to their probable lodging for the night. They found the snow on the slopes frozen hard, and the slow and laborious process of step cutting had to be resorted to. The shadows lengthened, night came down, and the moon rose slowly in the sky. By its feeble light they continued on their way, keeping alive the last slender shred of hope that there might be steps cut ready for their descent. But in this also they were doomed to disappointment. Undaunted, they set to work to carve their own way down the steep blue ice, but in a few minutes the intense cold and the apparent foolhardiness of the venture made them decide to wait until morning. Returning to the rocks, they chose a sheltered corner in which to pass the night, and began to rake out the snow which had accumulated with their axes. The exertion of this work warmed them up a little, and after a few mouthfuls of food they sat down, prepared to make the best of a most uncomfortable and cheerless bivouac. It seemed as if the night would never pass. The three men huddled together for warmth. The uppers of their boots were frozen, and they had to keep stamping their feet and beating their arms to prevent frostbite, while all the time they were struggling against an almost overpowering inclination to go to sleep. Dawn found them very much exhausted, and they gladly welcomed the light. Breakfast was their first thought, but to their dismay the scanty supply of provisions they had husbanded from the night before was worthless. The eggs were turned into icicles, the bread was as hard as wood, and would have required an axe to cut it. Even the spirits they had with them were frozen. Hungry, thirsty, and dispirited, they started to resume cutting the steps, but the wind was so cold, and their nerves so unsteady through exposure and want of food, that they had to wait for another hour till the sun warmed the rock to some extent. Again they essayed the descent, this time with success. As they made their way down, they had good reason to be thankful that they had listened to the dictates of prudence on the previous night, and had not attempted to descend in the dark, for they could not have done so without coming to grief. Wearily they dragged themselves along, their only refreshment an occasional mouthful of water, and it was not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that Grindelwald was reached. Here, surrounded by the comforts of the hotel, their hardships were forgotten, and only the delights of triumph were remembered. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Entombed in a Glacier. One of the most thrilling episodes recorded in the annals of mountain climbing took place in August 1897. Herr Sachs, a gentleman from Breslau, had left Zermatt with 2 guides on a mountain expedition, when, about noon on the second day, he suddenly sank up to his armpits in a crevasse of the Trift Glacier, which had been hidden from view by the freshly fallen snow. At first his position did not seem to be dangerous, as he was roped to his companions, and he was not in any way alarmed at the occurrence. He attempted to work his way out by the help of his axe, but without success. Then one of the guides called to him to stop beating about and told him to fix the weapon firmly in the ice. "I will then catch hold of it," he explained, "so that you will have a firm hold and be able to draw yourself out." This was done, but just as the guide was about to seize the axe, Sachs raised his arm, the noose of the rope slipped from it, and the unfortunate man sank without a word into the depths below. The whole affair happened so suddenly that for a moment the guides stood petrified with horror, but it was only for a moment. At the top of their speed they hastened for help. On their way they met three gentlemen, to whom they told the alarming story. Two of them happened, fortunately, to be doctors, and they at once hurried towards the crevasse, while the guides pursued their way to Zermatt. It was 7 o'clock when the three arrived at the crevasse, and on looking back they saw a column of guides working their way up from below with tremendous exertions. This courageous little band had overcome difficulties in 3½ hours, which, under ordinary circumstances, could not be surmounted in 6, even by a good mountaineer. In a short time 15 stalwart guides, with a plentiful supply of ropes, reached the scene of the accident. Moser, the eldest guide present, took the command. The crevasse was first examined. It was about 1.5 yards across, and widened out considerably at the bottom. The place where Sachs had fallen through was marked by a hole just large enough for a man's body to pass. Then one of the guides bent over the opening and shouted down. He listened intently for a few seconds. Then, turning to his companions, he cried joyfully, "The gentleman lives!" Such a possibility had never entered their thoughts, and they received the news doubtfully. Indeed, they had brought sacks with them in full anticipation of having to take down a corpse. Others bent down and shouted. There was no answer. Several anxious moments were passed, and again the shout, "Are you alive?" was thundered out. "I am alive, and have only broken my arm," came in a hollow voice from the depths. A warm dispute took place among the guides, each of whom wished to have the honour of being let down into the awful chasm. This difficult question was at length decided by the choice falling on Joseph Kronig, the lightest man of the party. A rope was tied round him, and he was lowered. 1 glacier rope length was paid out. Another was tied on and speedily lowered, and a third was required before Sachs was reached. This indicated a depth of about 200 feet. The guide found Sachs sitting on a snow-covered bank of ice above a still deeper ice abyss, which seemed to be fathomless. On seeing his deliverer, he coolly called out, "Good evening. How do you like it down here?" A second rope was lowered, and as Sachs was a heavy man, a third was deemed necessary to guard as far as possible against any chance of further mishap. Kronig fastened the rope about him securely, and he was raised. He had nearly reached the upper layer of snow when it appeared almost impossible to get him to the top, for the ropes cut deep into the snow. At last a guide seized his coat collar and dragged him over by sheer force. "Thank God! So I am out?" cried the rescued man. When Kronig was hauled up from the ice tomb, Sachs was examined by the doctors. His right arm hung helpless by his side. There was an ugly wound on his head from which the blood still flowed, and his chest and limbs were severely bruised. A little refreshment was then given him, and the downward march commenced. The Trifthötter was not reached till 11 o'clock at night. Here Sachs was bound and plastered, and his sprained shoulder was set. Next morning they returned to Zermatt. His story of what happened after he disappeared from the view of his guides is very interesting. "After the fall I was unconscious for a long period. When I came to myself I found I was alone on an ice bank. I cried for help again and again, but all in vain. I took off my gloves and sat on them as a protection from the terrible cold. The ice chamber in which I was like a vault above me, and to reach it I must have fallen from one ice ledge to another. To this circumstance I probably owe my life, for had not my fall been broken, I must inevitably have been dashed to pieces. I counted the hours as they passed, and in imagination measured the distance which would have to be traversed by those who came to my rescue. To while away the dreary hours I tried to make notes in my pocket book, but thoughts of my wife drove away all others. The chief thing, of course, was to keep awake, and that was no easy matter, but I did it. Never shall I forget how, in spite of agonising thirst and suffering, I struggled against sleep for 7 long hours. At last, but I cannot describe my feelings when I knew that help was at hand." His escape from death in the first instance, and his subsequent rescue, had alike been extraordinary. End of chapter 15. End of Stories of Alpine Adventure by Frank Mundell.